Hello and welcome back to the Midnight Historian. On a warm and windy Sunday evening in October 1871, in a modest wooden cottage on the west side of Chicago, a family named O'Leary had already gone to bed. Patrick O'Leary was a laborer, and his wife Catherine kept 5 cows in a small barn behind the house, selling milk to the neighbors along DeKoven Street to help make ends meet in a working-class immigrant district where nearly everyone was scraping by in more or less the same way. The O'Learys were asleep by the time the trouble started, and this small, almost trivial fact, that they were in bed and not in the barn, would matter enormously in the years that followed, because it meant that when the most famous fire in American history broke out in the shed behind their home, not one of them could actually say for certain how it had begun. They only knew, as their neighbors began pounding on the door and shouting into the smoky dark, that the barn was already burning, that the flames were already climbing into the dry hay stored in the loft above the cows, and that the wind, which had been blowing hard and dry from the southwest all day, was carrying sparks northeast toward the heart of a city built almost entirely out of wood. By the time that fire finally burned itself out some 31 hours later, it had killed roughly 300 people, left nearly a third of the city's residents without a home, and reduced something close to the entire central business district, the proud, commercial heart of what had been, only the day before, one of the fastest-growing cities the world had ever seen, to a field of smoking rubble and toppled chimneys stretching for miles in every direction. It would go down in history under a single name, the Great Chicago Fire, and it would take its place alongside a small handful of urban disasters so total, so transformative, that the city they struck can genuinely be divided into a before and an after. But like almost every disaster of that scale, the fire was not really the story of a single unlucky night at all. It was the story of a city that had spent barely 40 years growing at a pace that no place had ever quite grown before. A city that had thrown itself up out of the mud of a Lake Michigan swamp with such reckless speed and such total confidence that it had, without anyone ever quite intending it, assembled every single condition that a catastrophe of this size would ever need. Before we drift into the rest of this story, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It helps other restless, sleepless people find their way to this little corner of the night. And there is something pleasant about knowing that somewhere far away, a stranger is settling under the same dark sky, listening to the same slow story. So get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the bed, and let yourself ease into the tale of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, the night a young and reckless city burned nearly to the ground, and the strange, stubborn, almost defiant way it hauled itself back up out of its own ashes to become something larger and grander than it had ever been before. To really understand how one small barn fire on a working-class street managed to consume the commercial heart of a city of well over 300,000 people, we cannot begin with the O'Learys, or with their cows, or even with that dry and windy Sunday evening in October. We have to begin much earlier, decades earlier, because the Chicago that burned in 1871 was not simply an unlucky city that happened to catch fire on a bad night. It was a city that had spent its entire short, frantic existence quietly building the exact conditions a catastrophe like this one needed. And to see how, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a time when Chicago was not a great city at all, but a scattering of huts beside a sluggish river at the edge of an enormous inland sea. A city conjured out of mud. There is almost nothing in the history of American cities quite like the speed at which Chicago came into being, and it is worth dwelling on that speed for a moment, because it explains more about the fire than any single detail of the fire itself ever could. In the early 1830s, the place that would become Chicago was barely a settlement at all, a rough collection of cabins and a small, military fort clustered around the mouth of a slow, marshy river where it emptied into the southwestern corner of Lake Michigan. The ground was low and wet, so wet that in the rainy seasons the streets became channels of thick, sucking mud deep enough, according to the jokes that residents told for decades afterward, to swallow a horse whole. And travelers who passed through in those earliest years rarely had a kind word to say about the prospects of a town built on such unpromising, waterlogged ground. Fewer than 100 people lived there when the settlement was first organized. Within a single human lifetime, that number would pass 1 million. Nothing about the place's beginning suggested that it was destined for anything at all, let alone for the explosive, almost violent growth that was about to seize hold of it and never quite let go. What changed everything? What turned a muddy frontier outpost into one of the great cities of the 19th century world was geography, and specifically the particular kind of geography that mattered enormously in an age just beginning to knit itself together with canals and, very soon afterward, with railroads. Chicago sat at a genuinely extraordinary crossroads, though almost nobody living in its early cabins would have understood the full scale of the advantage they were sitting on top of. It stood at the southwestern tip of the Great Lakes, that vast chain of inland freshwater seas that connected, by water, all the way east to the Atlantic Ocean. And it sat at the same time right at the edge of the immense, fertile, agricultural heartland of the American interior, the endless prairies that were about to be broken by the plow and turned into some of the most productive farmland on the face of the earth. Whoever controlled the point where the produce of that interior met the water route to the east would control one of the great trading choke points of a rapidly expanding nation. And Chicago, almost by accident of where the land happened to sit, was that point. In 1848, two developments arrived within months of one another that together lit the fuse on everything that followed. The first was the completion of a canal, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, that finally connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River system, meaning that a barge could now travel by water alone, from the eastern seaboard through the lakes to Chicago, and from Chicago onward, down through the vast river network to the Gulf of Mexico. The second, arriving that very same year, was the first railroad, and it was the railroad, far more than the canal, that would truly make the city's fortune. Over the following 2 decades, Chicago became the single greatest railroad hub the world had ever seen, a place where line after line converged from every direction, from the east, bringing manufactured goods and immigrants pouring in from the ports of the Atlantic coast, and from the west, carrying back the grain and the timber, and above all, the cattle and hogs of the exploding agricultural frontier. By the 1860s, more railroad track converged on Chicago than on any other city on the continent, and the whole restless, roaring apparatus of American westward expansion seemed to run, one way or another, straight through its streets. The grain came first, rivers of it, poured out of the newly broken prairie farms and funneled through Chicago's enormous grain elevators, towering wooden structures that stored the wheat and corn of half a continent before shipping it east to feed the growing cities of the seaboard and, increasingly, the growing cities of Europe beyond them. Then came the lumber, floated down from the vast pine forests of Wisconsin and Michigan to the north, stacked in seemingly endless yards along the branches of the Chicago River, waiting to be shipped back out across the treeless prairie where settlers, desperate for building material in a landscape that offered almost none of its own, would buy every board Chicago could send them. And then, most famously of all, came the animals. The Union Stockyards, opened in 1865 on the city's south side, became the largest concentration of meatpacking and slaughter the world had ever assembled in one place. A sprawling city within a city of pens and chutes and killing floors where the cattle and hogs of the entire American West were driven, sold, slaughtered, and shipped, and where the innovations in refrigeration and assembly line butchery pioneered in. Those years would go on to reshape how the entire industrialized world fed itself. Chicago, in other words, had become the great throat of a continent, the place through which the raw wealth of the American interior was funneled, processed, and sent out into the wider world. and the money that flowed through that throat built, with astonishing speed, a city to match. A city built almost entirely out of wood. And here we arrive at the single most important fact about Chicago in 1871, the fact that sits underneath everything else in this story, the fact that turned a bad barn fire into a civilization-ending catastrophe. The city had been built, almost in its entirety, out of wood. This was not an accident, and it was not, by the standards of the time and place, even an obviously foolish choice. Chicago had grown so fast, so explosively, that there had simply been no time and no reason to build slowly and expensively in brick and stone when timber was cheap, abundant, and quite literally piling up in enormous yards all along the river waiting to be used. The lumber trade that had helped make the city rich had also, as a direct and entirely predictable consequence, made the city itself a vast and interconnected structure of dry, seasoned pine. And by 1871, that structure had reached a scale that is genuinely difficult to convey to anyone accustomed to thinking of a modern city as a thing made of concrete and steel. Consider what a person walking through Chicago on the eve of the fire would actually have been surrounded by. The houses, of course, were wood, from the grand homes of the wealthy on the fashionable avenues to the endless small cottages of the working districts where families like the O'Learys lived. And even many of the buildings that presented a proud face of brick or stone to the street were, behind that face, framed and floored and roofed in timber that would burn just as readily as any cottage once the flames found a way inside. But it went far beyond the buildings themselves. The sidewalks, in enormous stretches of the city, were made of wooden planks, raised up on wooden supports above the notoriously muddy ground, so that a pedestrian in much of Chicago was quite literally walking along an elevated wooden platform running for miles through the streets. Many of the streets themselves were paved not with stone, but with wooden blocks, set into the ground like bricks and sealed with tar and pitch. A cheap and popular paving method of the era that had the unfortunate property, once heated sufficiently, of burning with real enthusiasm. There were wooden fences dividing nearly every property from its neighbor. There were wooden barns and sheds and stables tucked behind nearly every house, most of them stuffed, as the O'Leary's barn was, with hay and straw and firewood and the ordinary flammable clutter of 19th century domestic life. There were the lumber yards themselves, acre upon acre of stacked, drying timber lining the river. There were coal yards, and there were the great grain elevators, and there were countless small workshops and factories packed with the flammable raw materials of 100 different trades. A city like this was not merely capable of burning. It was, in the most literal sense imaginable, a single continuous mass of fuel, laid out street by street across an area of several square miles, waiting only for a sufficient spark and a sufficient wind to be turned, all at once, into one enormous fire. And the truly frightening thing, the thing that makes this story feel at times almost like a slow-motion account of a disaster that everyone could see coming and nobody quite managed to prevent, is that the people of Chicago were not entirely ignorant of the danger they were living inside. They knew, in a general and uncomfortable way, that their city was a fire trap. They had been warned, more than once and by more than one voice, that a catastrophe was not merely possible but genuinely likely. And they had, for reasons that will feel painfully familiar to anyone who has watched a community fail to act on a danger it can see, but has not yet been forced to feel, done very little about it. A press that saw it coming. The warnings were not vague, and they were not buried in obscure places where nobody would ever read them. In the weeks and months before the fire, the city's own newspapers had been sounding the alarm about Chicago's terrifying vulnerability to a large fire with a directness that reads, in hindsight, almost like prophecy. The summer and autumn of 1871 had been extraordinarily dry, one of the driest anyone in the region could remember, with almost no meaningful rain falling across the entire area for months on end. and the wooden city had baked through that long, rainless stretch until its boards and shingles and plank sidewalks had dried out to the point where they would take a flame almost as readily as kindling. Small fires had been breaking out across the city with unusual frequency all through that parched autumn, the natural consequence of so much dry wood packed so tightly together, and the fire department had been run ragged, responding to one blaze after another, so that by the second week of October, the men and the horses and the equipment of Chicago's firefighting force were already worn thin and badly overstretched before the great disaster even began. Editorial writers had pointed to all of this and drawn the obvious, unwelcome conclusion. They had noted the drought, the wooden construction, the crowding, the flammable materials stored throughout the city, and the strain on an undersized fire department, and they had warned, in plain language, that the conditions were assembling for a fire far larger than anything the department could hope to contain, a fire that might, if it ever truly got loose, sweep through entire districts before anyone could stop it. One newspaper in particular had run a piece only weeks before the disaster warning explicitly that the city was courting exactly this kind of catastrophe, that its reckless wooden construction and its inadequate defenses were an invitation to ruin. These warnings, like the warnings that had preceded so many disasters before and would precede so many after, were read and perhaps briefly worried over, and then set aside, because there was always business to attend to and money to be made, and the fire, after all, had not happened yet. It is one of the quieter tragedies buried in this story, and a pattern we will see again and again across the history of human disaster, that a community can know, in a clear and documented and even publicly stated way, that it is living inside a trap, and still find itself unable to summon the collective will to climb out of it until the trap has already sprung. The fire that came before. There is a piece of this story that is very easy to overlook, because it has been almost entirely overshadowed by the enormous catastrophe that followed it barely a day later, and it deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because it tells us a great deal about just how exhausted and depleted Chicago's defenses already were when the real disaster struck. On the night of Saturday, October the 7th, the evening before the Great Fire began, a serious blaze had broken out in the west side of the city, in a district packed with mills, factories, and lumber, and it had grown large enough and stubborn enough that fighting it consumed the better part of an entire night and drew in nearly the whole of the city's firefighting strength. This fire, which came to be remembered rather grimly as the Saturday Night Fire, destroyed several blocks of the city and, crucially, left the fire department in a state of near total exhaustion when the sun came up on Sunday morning. The men had been awake and working through the whole of that Saturday night, hauling hose and working pumps and breathing smoke, and by Sunday they were spent, physically drained in a way that no amount of daylight rest could fully repair in a single day. Just as importantly, some of the department's equipment had been damaged or worn out in the effort, hoses burst or badly frayed. At least one of the steam-powered fire engines that formed the backbone of the department's firefighting capacity put out of service or in need of repair. The department that would be called upon, barely more than 24 hours later, to face the largest urban fire in the nation's history, was therefore not a fresh and rested force at the peak of its readiness. It was a small, tired, battered organization that had just fought one grueling battle and had not yet had anything close to enough time to recover from it. When we come to judge, as people always do in the aftermath of disaster, how the firefighters of Chicago performed on the terrible night that followed, it is only fair to remember that they went into that fight already half-beaten, already running on empty, already stretched past the point where any group of men could reasonably be expected to perform at their best. The department itself, even at full strength and fully rested, was badly undersized for a city of Chicago's scale and Chicago's peculiar flammability. It numbered only a few hundred men, responsible for defending a sprawling city of well over 300,000 residents spread across many square miles of densely packed wooden construction. And while it possessed a number of the modern steam fire engines that represented the cutting edge of firefighting technology in that era, Machines capable of pumping water with a force and volume that the old hand-worked pumps could never have matched. It simply did not have enough of them, nor enough men to work them, to cope with a fire that broke out across a wide front and spread faster than the engines could be moved to meet it. The city had grown so fast that its defenses had never come close to keeping pace with its size, and this too was part of the trap. Chicago had built itself, in a few short decades, into one of the largest cities in the country, and it had done so without ever pausing to build the kind of robust, adequately funded fire defense that a city of dry timber packed so tightly together so desperately needed. The alarm that failed. To make matters worse, the very system that was supposed to summon the fire department to a blaze quickly and accurately, the system on which every hope of catching a fire early and stopping it small ultimately depended, failed on the night it was needed most. And it failed in a way that cost the city dearly in the crucial opening minutes when the fire might still, conceivably, have been contained. Chicago at this time relied on a network of fire alarm boxes distributed around the city, and on a central watchtower manned by a lookout whose job was to scan the horizon for smoke and flame and, upon spotting a fire, to identify its location and signal the appropriate fire companies to respond. It was a reasonable system for its era, and on an ordinary night it worked well enough. On the night of the Great Fire, it broke down almost completely. The watchman on duty in the courthouse tower that night, a man named Matthias Schaffer, did spot the glow of the fire not long after it began, but in the smoky, wind-blown dark, and misled perhaps by the way the light of the growing blaze reflected and spread against the sky, he misjudged its location and directed the first fire companies to a spot well over a mile away from where the fire was actually burning. By the time the mistake was recognized and corrected, precious minutes had been lost, minutes in which the fire, driven by that relentless dry wind, had grown from something that a fast and accurate response might conceivably have contained into something already well on its way to becoming uncontrollable. Schaffer, realizing his error, tried to send out a corrected alarm, but through a further failure of the system, a reluctance to sound a second, conflicting signal that might confuse the responding companies, the correction was delayed or muddled, and the full weight of the department's response arrived at the actual scene of the fire later than it should have, later than it needed to, later than the desperate circumstances of a wooden city in a high wind could afford. It is a small, bureaucratic, almost mundane failure, a man in a tower squinting into the dark and guessing wrong, and then a hesitation about how to correct the guess. But it sits near the very beginning of the disaster like a loose thread, and everything that followed unraveled in part from exactly that kind of small and ordinary human error compounding, minute by minute, into catastrophe. The barn on DeKoven Street. And so we come, at last, to the barn, and to the small wooden cottage in front of it, and to the family asleep inside, and to the single most famous animal in the history of American disaster, a cow who almost certainly did nothing at all, but who has borne the blame for a burning city for more than a century and a half regardless. The O'Leary property stood on DeKoven Street, on the west side of the city, in a crowded working-class district populated largely by Irish immigrants and other families of modest means, people who lived, as the O'Learys did, in small wooden houses on small lots, keeping animals and gardens and whatever small enterprises they could manage to help stretch a laborer's wages far enough to feed a family. Catherine O'Leary kept her 5 cows in the barn behind the house and sold their milk to the neighbors, an ordinary and entirely respectable way for a working woman of that time and place to bring in a little extra money. And there was nothing about the O'Learys or their small dairy operation that marked them out in any way from the thousands of other families living lives just like theirs across the west side of Chicago. Sometime in the mid-evening of Sunday, October the 8th, a fire started in that barn. That much is certain, and essentially nothing about what happened next is disputed. What is disputed? What has been disputed from the very first hours after the fire and remains genuinely unresolved to this day is how, exactly, the fire in the barn began, And here we run headlong into one of the most enduring and most unfair legends in all of American history. The story that took hold almost immediately, the story that spread through the traumatized city in the days after the disaster and then out across the entire country and around the world, was that Catherine O'Leary had gone out to the barn that evening to milk one of her cows, and that the cow, startled or simply ill-tempered, had kicked over a lit kerosene lantern she had set down beside it, and that the spilled, flaming kerosene had ignited the straw on the barn floor and set the whole structure ablaze. It is a vivid, memorable, satisfying little story, the kind of story that lodges in the collective memory and refuses to leave. And it had the additional appeal, for a frightened and grieving public looking for someone to blame, of attaching the greatest disaster in the city's history to a poor Irish immigrant woman and her clumsy cow. A target that a certain kind of prejudice found all too convenient in the 19th century America of that moment. There is, however, a very serious problem with the story of Mrs. O'Leary and her lantern-kicking cow. And the problem is this: it is almost certainly not true. Catherine O'Leary herself insisted, from the very beginning and for the rest of her life, that she had not been in the barn at all when the fire started, that she and her whole family had already gone to bed, and that she had been woken, like everyone else on DeKoven Street, only by the shouts of neighbors raising the alarm once the barn was already burning. There is no good reason to disbelieve her, and a good deal of reason to believe her, because the tale of the kicking cow appears to have been, quite simply, invented, made up out of whole cloth by a newspaper reporter looking for a colorful and memorable explanation for a story that badly needed one. Years later, one of the journalists involved in the early reporting on the fire actually admitted that the detail of the cow and the lantern had been fabricated, a piece of invented human color grafted onto the disaster to make it more vivid and more saleable. And yet the confession, when it finally came, did almost nothing to dislodge the legend, which by then had sunk so deeply into the popular imagination that it has survived, largely intact, right up to the present day. The genuinely sad thing, the human thing worth sitting with for a moment, is what this invented story did to a real woman's life. Catherine O'Leary was, by every account, a private, hard-working, unremarkable person who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to raise her family and sell her milk. And the fire made her, entirely against her will and entirely without cause, one of the most reviled figures in the country, blamed by strangers for the deaths of hundreds of people and the destruction of a great city, hounded and gawked at and turned into a cruel joke that would outlast her by well over a century. She spent the rest of her life, by the accounts of those who knew her, embittered and withdrawn, refusing to speak to reporters, retreating from a public that had made her the villain of a catastrophe she had almost certainly had nothing to do with, and she died decades later still carrying a blame that was never hers to carry. It is a small injustice, set against the enormous scale of death and destruction the fire caused, but it is a real one, and it is worth remembering, when we picture that barn beginning to burn, that the woman history chose to blame was very probably as innocent as anyone else asleep on DeKoven Street that night, and considerably more unlucky in what the world decided to do with her afterward. So if it was not the cow, what did start the fire? The honest answer is that nobody knows, and nobody ever will, and that this is one of those places where the historical record simply closes over and refuses to give up its secret. Over the years, a great many theories have been offered, some more plausible than others. It has been suggested that a group of neighborhood men, including a man who lived nearby and was known to have been in and around the O'Leary property that evening, may have been in the barn playing cards or gambling and smoking, and that a carelessly dropped match or the ashes from a pipe may have set the straw alight. A theory that has the ring of plausibility to it precisely because it is so ordinary. so much the kind of small, careless human accident that starts fires in barns full of dry hay all the time. It has been suggested, more colorfully and far more speculatively, that a fragment of a comet passing near the Earth that autumn may have showered the region with burning debris. An idea that has attracted a certain amount of attention over the years, chiefly because several other serious fires broke out across the wider Midwest on that very same night. Though the mainstream of historical and scientific opinion regards the comet theory as extremely unlikely, and the simultaneous fires as far more probably explained by the simple fact that the entire region was suffering the same drought, the same dryness, and the same high winds all at once. And it has been suggested, most mundanely of all, that the fire may simply have started through some entirely ordinary accident with a lantern or a lamp or a stray ember, with no cow and no card game and no comet involved at all. Just the same kind of small, stupid, unglamorous mischance that has burned down countless barns across the history of the world without anyone bothering to remember them. What actually matters, in the end, is not how the fire in the barn began, because a barn fire, on its own, was nothing remarkable in a city like Chicago, and on almost any other night it would have burned the O'Leary's barn and perhaps a neighbor's shed or two and then been put out and forgotten within the week. What mattered, what turned this particular barn fire into the Great Chicago Fire, was everything the fire found waiting for it once it escaped the barn. The dry wooden neighborhood packed tightly around it, the exhausted and misdirected fire department slow to arrive, and above all the wind. That hard, dry, relentless wind blowing steadily out of the southwest, ready to pick up the sparks of one burning barn and carry them, like a torch passed from hand to hand, straight into the heart of the largest wooden city on the continent. The first hour, and a fire that would not be caught. In those first crucial minutes after the flames took hold of the O'Leary barn, there was still, in theory, a chance. Fires started in barns, and barns burned down, and the loss of a single wooden barn full of hay was the kind of thing a competent fire company could ordinarily contain to the property where it began, or at worst, to the immediate cluster of buildings around it. But the chance, such as it was, depended entirely on speed, on getting men and engines and water to the barn while the fire was still small enough to be fought. And speed was precisely the thing that Chicago's exhausted, misdirected department could not deliver on that particular night. We have already seen how the watchman in the tower guessed wrong and sent the first companies more than a mile astray, and how the correction was fumbled and delayed. The consequence of that failure played out on DeKoven Street in the most direct and merciless way imaginable. While the fire companies were rushing to the wrong location and then, belatedly, being redirected to the right one, the fire in the barn was not politely waiting for them. It was spreading, fast, from the barn to the neighboring sheds and fences and cottages, feeding on the dry wood all around it and driven forward by the wind, so that by the time the first firefighters actually reached the true scene of the blaze, it was already too large for the force at hand to master, already leaping from building to building faster than the men could lay their hose. The wind is the true villain of this story, if it needs a villain at all, and it deserves to be understood clearly, because without it, there is no Great Chicago Fire, only a forgotten barn fire on a forgotten street. The wind that night blew hard out of the southwest, and it blew with a steadiness and a force that turned every spark thrown up by the burning West Side neighborhood into a potential seed of a new fire somewhere downwind. This is the mechanism by which a contained blaze becomes an unstoppable one, not simply the advance of the flames themselves along the ground, building to building, which is dangerous enough, but the hurling of burning brands and embers high into the air and far ahead of the main fire, so that new fires spring up hundreds of feet in front of the blaze, in places the flames themselves have not yet reached and the defenders have not yet thought to guard. On a still night, a fire spreads only as fast as it can eat its way forward. On a windy night in a wooden city, a fire can leap ahead of itself again and again, planting new fires faster than any department on Earth could hope to extinguish them. And this is exactly what began to happen across the west side of Chicago in the late evening of October the 8th. The neighborhood around DeKoven Street went first. The small wooden cottages and barns and fences of the working-class Irish district catching one after another and merging into a single advancing wall of flame that pushed steadily to the northeast, driven by the wind toward the branch of the river that separated the west side from the commercial heart of the city beyond it. Families fled into the streets in whatever they had been wearing or sleeping in, snatching up children and whatever few possessions they could carry, and the ordinary human chaos of a neighborhood in flight, the shouting and the weeping and the frantic loading of carts, began to play out on street after street as the fire ate its way through the district where it had been born. And already, in these first hours, the fire was doing something that would define the entire disaster and make it so uniquely difficult to fight. It was moving faster than the people trying to escape it in some places, and faster than the people trying to fight it in nearly all of them, throwing its burning brands ahead on the wind so that a family fleeing what they thought was the edge of the fire would suddenly find new flames springing up in the street ahead of them, cutting off the very route they had chosen for their escape, the leap across the river. There was, in the minds of many Chicagoans that night, one great reason for hope, one natural barrier that stood between the burning west side and the far more valuable, more densely built commercial districts to the north and east, and that barrier was the Chicago River itself. The river, with its various branches, wound through the city, and it was reasonable to hope, as many people did in those early hours, that a wide channel of open water would prove too much for even this fire to cross, that the flames would burn themselves out against the riverbank, unable to leap the gap, and that the great business district and the crowded north side beyond it would be spared. It was a reasonable hope, and it was completely wrong, and the manner in which it was proven wrong tells you almost everything about just how ferocious this fire had already become, and just how thoroughly Chicago had prepared the ground for its own destruction. The river did not stop the fire for a simple and dreadful reason. The river was not, in any meaningful firefighting sense, a barrier of open water at all. Its banks and even its surface were crowded with exactly the same flammable materials as the rest of the city, and in some places worse. Wooden bridges crossed it, and they burned. Ships and barges lay moored along it, many of them wooden, and they burned. The banks were lined with lumber yards stacked high with drying timber, with coal yards, with warehouses full of goods, with grain elevators, with all the flammable industry of a great trading port, and these too caught and burned, so that the river, far from serving as a fire break, became in places a corridor of fire, its edges blazing on both sides. And the wind, of course, cared nothing for the river at all, picking up burning brands from the western bank and flinging them clear across the water to land among the buildings on the far side, planting new fires on the eastern shore, while the flames were still consuming the western one. The river that so many had trusted to save the city proved no obstacle whatsoever to a wind-driven firestorm hurling burning debris hundreds of feet through the air. And once the fire had crossed the water, once it had established itself in the districts beyond, the last real hope of containing it to a single section of the city was gone. There is a detail here that has stuck in the memory of the fire ever since, and it captures the strange, almost supernatural horror of what the city was experiencing that night. Witnesses spoke afterward of what they called fire devils, or fire whirls, great spinning columns and balls of flame that formed within the heart of the blaze, where the tremendous heat and the driving wind combined to create violent, twisting vortices of fire, rising and spinning and hurling themselves across gaps that ordinary flames could never have crossed. These whirling towers of fire, some of them apparently large enough and violent enough to lift burning debris and even fragments of buildings into the air, were the visible, terrifying signature of a fire that had grown so large and so hot that it was generating its own weather, its own violent internal winds, a self-sustaining engine of destruction that no longer needed anything but fuel and would find fuel everywhere it looked. To the people watching from the streets and from the rooftops and from the boats out on the lake, it must have seemed less like a fire in the ordinary sense than like something out of the end of the world, an inferno that spun and leaped and threw fire across the sky as though it were alive and hunting. The heart of the city catches. Once the fire had crossed the river and taken hold in the districts beyond, it entered the part of the city that Chicago was proudest of and had the most to lose, the central business district. The dense commercial core where the great banks and hotels and department stores and office blocks and newspaper offices and the grand new courthouse all stood packed together in a display of the wealth and confidence and ambition that had made Chicago the marvel of the American interior. This was the Chicago that the world had come to admire, the boomtown made good, the muddy frontier outpost transformed in a single generation into a genuine metropolis of stone-faced buildings and busy streets and roaring commerce. And it was here, in the small hours of Monday morning, that the fire did its most spectacular and most economically devastating work. Many of the buildings in this district were, unlike the wooden cottages of the West Side, substantial structures of brick and stone, and their owners had believed, with the particular confidence of people who have spent a great deal of money on something, that they were fireproof. This belief was, tragically, an illusion, and the fire exposed it with brutal thoroughness. The buildings of the business district may have presented walls of brick and stone to the street, but behind and beneath those walls they were, like nearly everything in Chicago, riddled with wood. Wooden floors, wooden beams, wooden window frames, wooden interior structures, wooden roofs beneath their stone facings, and above all, wooden contents, the furniture and goods and papers and merchandise that filled every room. A fire of the intensity that was now bearing down on the district did not need to knock down a brick wall to destroy the building behind it. It only needed to reach the wood inside, through a window, through a roof, through any opening the flames or the flying embers could find. And once it was inside, the brick and stone shell served only to contain the heat, turning the building into a kind of oven that burned out its own interior with terrible efficiency before the walls themselves, cracked and weakened by the extraordinary temperatures, finally buckled and collapsed. The supposedly fireproof buildings burned nearly as completely as the wooden ones, and in some cases their collapse, when it came, was more sudden and more deadly. Among the most symbolically devastating losses of that night was the courthouse, the proud civic building at the very center of the city, the seat of local government, crowned by the tall tower from which the watchman had first spotted and misjudged the distant glow of the fire. As the flames closed in around it, the great bell in that tower was rung continuously, a desperate tolling alarm sounding out across a city that hardly needed telling any longer that it was burning, and prisoners held in the jail in the courthouse basement were hurriedly released, some of them, so that they would not be burned alive in their cells as the building came down around them. When the fire finally took the courthouse, the tower and its bell came crashing down together, and the sound of that great bell falling through the collapsing building was, for many who heard it, the moment the true scale of the catastrophe became undeniable, the moment it became clear that not even the grandest and most important buildings in the city, not even the seat of government itself, would be spared. If the courthouse could burn, anything could burn. And everything, that night, very nearly did. The waterworks and the death of hope. And now we come to the single most catastrophic stroke of bad luck in the entire disaster. The moment that transformed a terrible fire that might still, conceivably, have been fought and eventually contained into an unstoppable one that would simply have to be allowed to burn until it ran out of city to consume. Every effort to fight the fire, every fire engine pumping, every hose laid, every bucket filled, depended ultimately on a single thing: water. And the water that supplied the entire city, the water on which every hope of fighting the fire depended, came from a single central pumping station, the city waterworks, which drew water from the lake and pumped it out through the mains to the hydrants and the standpipes all across Chicago. As long as the waterworks stood and the pumps kept running, the firefighters had at least the raw material of their fight. If the waterworks failed, they had nothing at all. Sometime in the early hours of Monday morning, A burning brand carried on that same relentless wind flew through the air and landed on the roof of the waterworks itself. And the roof, which was made of wood, caught fire. The waterworks, the one building in the entire city that absolutely could not be allowed to burn, the building on which the defense of everything else depended, was itself undefended against the very thing it was meant to help fight. And once its roof caught, the fire spread into the structure and destroyed the pumping machinery inside. And the moment the pump stopped, the water stopped. All across Chicago, the hydrants ran dry. The hoses went slack. The engines had nothing left to pump. And the firefighters, already exhausted, already overwhelmed, found themselves standing before the greatest fire any of them had ever seen, with the water quite literally cut off at the source. From that moment on, there was, in any practical sense, no fighting the fire at all. There was only fleeing from it and salvaging what could be salvaged, and waiting and praying for the wind to die, or the rain to come, or the fire to reach some natural edge of the city where it would finally run out of fuel. The destruction of the waterworks was the moment the disaster became, in the fullest sense, a natural disaster. A force beyond human control that would simply have to be endured until it chose, of its own accord, to stop. It is worth pausing on the cruelty of that single burning brand, the sheer staggering bad luck of it, because it is the kind of detail that makes a disaster feel less like a chain of comprehensible causes and more like the work of some malevolent chance. Of all the countless brands the wind flung across the city that night, of all the roofs and yards and streets they might have landed on, one of them found the single most important roof in Chicago, the one building whose loss would doom all the others, and it set that roof alight at precisely the moment the city could least afford to lose it. Had that one brand fallen anywhere else, had the waterworks survived even a few hours longer, the story of the fire might have been meaningfully different. The destruction perhaps contained to a smaller area, thousands of buildings perhaps saved. But it did not fall anywhere else. It fell on the waterworks, and the waterworks burned, and with it burned the last real hope of stopping the fire by any means other than waiting for it to stop itself. The flight of a city. As the fire tore through the business district and pushed relentlessly onward into the crowded north side beyond, the human story of the night became, more than anything else, a story of flight, of hundreds of thousands of people abandoning their homes and their possessions and running, often quite literally for their lives, ahead of a wall of fire that in places moved faster than they could. It is difficult, at the remove of a century and a half, to fully grasp the scale of the panic and the displacement, but the numbers give some sense of it. Chicago in 1871 had a population of well over 300,000, and by the time the fire had finished its work, roughly a third of them, something close to 100,000 people, had lost their homes entirely. That is 100,000 people turned out into the streets in the space of a single night and day, fleeing before the flames with whatever they could carry, streaming north and east and out toward the open prairie and the shore of the lake, anywhere the fire was not. The scenes along the routes of that flight, preserved in the letters and diaries and later recollections of those who lived through them, are a catalog of the ordinary human behavior that emerges when people are given no warning and no time and must simply grab what they can and run. People fled in their night clothes, having been woken by the roar of the fire or the shouts of neighbors and given only minutes to escape. They snatched up whatever happened to be nearest to hand, and the choices they made in those panicked moments were often strange and revealing and, in hindsight, sometimes almost comic in their impracticality. People saved bird cages and left behind fortunes. People carried heavy, useless objects for miles while abandoning the light and valuable things they might easily have taken. People loaded carts and wagons so heavily that the animals could not pull them, or so hastily that the load spilled and scattered in the streets, and the roads out of the burning districts became choked with abandoned furniture and belongings, dropped or discarded as the fire drew closer, and the fleeing crowds realized that survival mattered more than any possession, however precious it had seemed when they first grabbed it. Families were separated in the chaos and the smoke and the crush of the fleeing crowds, and the desperate searching for lost children and lost husbands and lost parents became one of the defining agonies of the night and of the days that followed, when the survivors, scattered across refugee camps and the open prairie and the homes of strangers who had taken them in, tried frantically to find one another again and to learn who had made it out and who had not. Some of those separations ended in tearful reunions in the days after the fire. Some of them, inevitably, did not, and the uncertainty, the not knowing, was its own particular kind of torment layered on top of the loss of everything else. There were acts of genuine heroism and kindness in the midst of the flight, as there always are. People who turned back into the smoke to pull neighbors and strangers to safety. People who carried the old and the sick and the very young. People who opened their homes on the unburned edges of the city to shelter the streams of refugees pouring out of the flames. And there were, as there also always are, acts of cruelty and greed and desperation, looting of the abandoned shops and homes, price gouging by those who suddenly found themselves in possession of scarce food or transportation or shelter, drunkenness and violence, and the general fraying of ordinary social order that tends to accompany a catastrophe of this scale. Saloons were broken into and their liquor consumed or carried off, and there were reports, some of them surely exaggerated in the retelling but many of them grimly true, of people so drunk amid the chaos that they stumbled back into the path of the fire and were lost. Human beings, placed suddenly and without warning into the middle of a burning city, behaved exactly as human beings tend to behave in such moments, which is to say in every possible way at once, nobly and shamefully and desperately and generously, sometimes all within the same person within the same terrible hour. Refuge in the lake. For a great many of those fleeing the fire, the ultimate destination, the place beyond which there was simply nowhere further to run, was the shore of Lake Michigan itself, the vast body of cold water at the city's eastern edge, and the lake became, on that terrible night, both a refuge and a trap, a place of safety and a place of its own particular horror. As the fire drove the fleeing crowds eastward, many of them were pushed all the way to the lakeshore and to the beaches and the parks along the water, and there, with the fire at their backs and the water before them, they could go no further. Thousands of people crowded onto the narrow strips of sand and open ground at the edge of the lake, packed together with whatever possessions they had managed to carry that far. And there they waited, with nowhere else to go, as the fire raged through the city behind them. For some, the water itself became the only refuge from the heat and the flying embers. People waded out into the cold lake, standing waist-deep or deeper in the water, and stood there for hours through the night, dousing themselves and one another to keep from catching fire as the burning brands rained down and the heat from the enormous blaze rolled out across the shore. Parents held children up out of the water. People buried what possessions they could in the wet sand at the water's edge, hoping to dig them up again when the fire had passed. And everyone simply endured, cold and terrified and exhausted, watching their city burn from the one place the fire could not reach them. There is something almost unbearably vivid about that image. Thousands of people standing in the dark, cold water of the lake, lit orange by the reflected glow of the burning city, watching everything they owned and everything they knew go up in flames on the shore before them, unable to do anything at all but stand in the water and wait for morning. It is one of the enduring pictures of the disaster, and it captures, better than almost any statistic could, the sheer helplessness of that night, the way the fire reduced hundreds of thousands of people, rich and poor alike, to the same condition of simply trying to survive until the sun came up. The north side burns. The fire, having crossed the main branch of the river and consumed the business district, crossed yet another branch and pushed on into the north side, a large and heavily populated residential district that contained everything from the grand mansions of the wealthy to the modest homes of the working and middle classes. And here the fire did some of its most complete and most heartbreaking work, burning through neighborhood after neighborhood with a thoroughness that left in the end almost nothing standing across a vast stretch of the district. The north side had seemed, to many of its residents, comfortably distant from the fire's origin on the far west side, separated from it by the whole width of the business district and by the river's various branches. And many Northsiders had gone to bed on Sunday night with no particular sense that they were in danger, only to be woken in the small hours by the terrible orange glow in the sky and the realization that the fire, which had seemed so far away, was now bearing down upon them with the speed of the wind that drove it. The destruction of the north side was, in its way, the most complete of the entire fire, because unlike the business district, which was at least partly built of brick and stone, and unlike the west side, where the fire had begun but where its spread had eventually been checked, the north side was a vast expanse of wooden residential construction directly downwind of the main body of the fire, and it burned almost in its entirety. Street after street, block after block, neighborhood after neighborhood was consumed, until the fire had reduced nearly the whole of the north side to an ashen wasteland, broken only here and there by a lone surviving structure, a single brick house that had somehow escaped, a water tower that had withstood the flames, standing like solitary tombstones amid the general devastation. Among the very few structures on the north side to survive the fire more or less intact was a single sturdy cottage, whose owner had reportedly saved it by the desperate expedient of covering it with wet blankets and rugs, and beating out every ember that landed on it through the whole long night. A small and stubborn victory of one determined household against the inferno, and a reminder that the difference between a house that survived and a house that burned was often nothing grander than luck, and the wind's direction, and a few people willing to fight for their home until the danger had passed. Voices from the burning city. We know as much as we do about the human texture of that night, the specific, close-up experience of what it was actually like to flee before the fire, largely because a great many of those who lived through it wrote down what they had seen in letters to distant relatives desperate for word that they had survived, in diaries, in accounts set down years later when the memory had settled but not faded. And these first-hand voices remain the beating heart of everything we understand about the disaster. Unlike some catastrophes of earlier centuries, which come down to us only through a handful of scattered official records, the Great Chicago Fire happened in a modern, literate, newspaper-reading city full of people accustomed to writing things down. And the result is a genuinely rich and moving body of testimony from people at every level of society. From wealthy merchants who lost fortunes to working families who lost the little they had. The accounts share certain features that recur again and again, and taken together they build a picture of the night that is remarkably consistent in its essentials. Nearly everyone who wrote about it dwelt on the sound. The tremendous, continuous roar of the fire. A noise that witnesses compared to everything from a great waterfall to an approaching train, to the sustained thunder of an artillery bombardment, punctuated by the sharp reports of buildings collapsing and the occasional deeper boom of some store of flammable material igniting all at once. Nearly everyone dwelt on the heat, which grew so intense in the districts nearest the main body of the fire that it could be felt at a genuinely startling distance, blistering paint and igniting wood well ahead of any actual flame, and which made the act of fleeing itself a kind of ordeal, the fugitives shielding their faces from a heat that seemed to press physically against them as they ran. And nearly everyone dwelt on the strange, apocalyptic quality of the light. The whole sky turned a lurid orange and red, bright enough to read a newspaper by in the middle of the night. The falling ash drifting down like a hot, dark snow across the fleeing crowds, the burning brands streaking overhead like a rain of fire. One quality that emerges strongly from the survivor accounts is the sheer disbelief, the difficulty that people had, even in the midst of it, in accepting that what was happening could actually be happening, that a great modern city could simply burn to the ground in a single night. Time and again the accounts describe people who lingered too long, who could not quite bring themselves to believe that the fire would really reach their home or their business, who went to bed on the far edges of the danger convinced that surely the flames would be stopped before they arrived, only to be shaken awake hours later by the discovery that the impossible was happening after all, and that they now had minutes rather than hours to flee. There is a particular kind of psychological paralysis that grips people in the early stages of an unfolding catastrophe, a refusal to update their sense of normal quickly enough to match a reality that is changing faster than the mind can accept. And the accounts of the Chicago fire are full of it, full of people who might have saved more, or fled sooner, or acted more decisively if only they had been able to believe, in time, that the thing they were watching was real. There are smaller, human details scattered through the accounts that lodge in the memory precisely because they are so ordinary, so recognizably human amid the enormity of the disaster. There are the people who, in the frantic minutes of their escape, made choices about what to save that they would puzzle over for the rest of their lives. The woman who carried a single teacup to safety while a house full of valuables burned behind her. The man who saved a bundle of old letters and left the family silver behind. There are the shopkeepers who flung open their doors and told the fleeing crowds to take whatever they could carry, reasoning that it was better for their goods to be worn or used by desperate neighbors than to burn uselessly in the coming flames. There are the countless small acts of neighborly decency, the sharing of a cart, the carrying of a stranger's child, the offering of a coat or a drink of water, that flickered here and there through the general chaos like small lights in an enormous darkness. And there are the darker details too, the looting and the drunkenness and the cruelty, which the honest accounts do not shy away from, because a disaster of this magnitude brings out the whole range of human behavior, and any account that pretends otherwise, that paints the night as one of unbroken heroism and solidarity, is not telling the truth about how people actually behave when their world is burning down around them. The rain, at last. The fire burned through the whole of that terrible Sunday night and all through Monday, spreading north and consuming the north side, and by Monday evening it had been burning for the better part of a day and a night with almost nothing to check it. The water gone, the department broken, the wind still driving it forward. And then, at last, late on Monday night into the early hours of Tuesday, the two things happened that human effort had been unable to accomplish, and that only nature itself could provide. The wind, which had driven the fire so relentlessly for so long, finally began to ease. And the rain that the parched city had not seen in months, the rain whose long absence had helped make the disaster possible in the first place, finally began to fall. It was not, at first, a heavy rain, but it did not need to be heavy to matter. By the time it began to fall, the fire had already consumed most of what lay in its path, and was beginning to reach the northern and eastern edges of the built-up city, the places where the density of fuel thinned out, where there were more open spaces and fewer buildings packed tightly together, and where the fire, running short of the continuous mass of wood it needed to sustain itself, was already beginning to lose some of its terrible momentum. The rain, arriving at that moment, was enough to finish what the thinning fuel and the dying wind had begun. It dampened the flames, it soaked the smoldering ruins, it quenched the countless small fires still burning throughout the devastated districts, and it prevented the embers from throwing up new blazes to carry the destruction further. Slowly, over the course of that wet Tuesday, the Great Chicago Fire, which no human effort had been able to stop, simply went out, drowned at last by the same weather whose long absence had helped bring it into being. The people of Chicago, or those 100,000 of them who now had no homes to return to, woke on Tuesday to a changed world, a cold, wet, ash-choked wasteland where their city had stood the day before. The rain that had put out the fire fell on a scene of almost incomprehensible devastation, on miles of smoking rubble and toppled walls and lone standing chimneys, on the exhausted and displaced survivors huddled in refugee camps and along the lakeshore and in the homes of relatives and strangers, on a city that had, in the space of about 31 hours, lost its entire commercial heart and a third of its housing and several hundred of its people. The fire was over. The reckoning and the long, strange, defiant story of what Chicago would choose to do next was only beginning. Counting what was lost, When the rain had finally done its work and the survivors began, cautiously, to move back through the still smoking ruins of their city to see what remained, the scale of the destruction proved almost impossible to take in all at once, and the numbers that eventually emerged, imperfect and disputed as some of them were, give at least the outline of a catastrophe that had few equals in the history of American cities. The fire had burned across an area of roughly 3.5 square miles, cutting a great swath of destruction through the heart of the city from the west side where it had begun, across the river and through the entire central business district, across another branch of the river, and through nearly the whole of the north side. Within that burned district, something on the order of 17,000 or 18,000 buildings had been destroyed, a figure that included nearly the entire commercial core of the city, the banks and hotels and stores and offices and warehouses and public buildings that had represented the accumulated wealth and ambition of Chicago's explosive rise, along with the tens of thousands of homes, from mansions to cottages, that had housed the roughly 100,000 people now left without shelter. The financial cost was staggering, running to a sum that represented a genuinely enormous proportion of the entire wealth of the city, and it fell with particular weight because so much of it was uninsured or, as it turned out, insured with companies that were themselves ruined by the sheer scale of the claims. Many of the insurance companies that had written policies on Chicago properties simply could not pay when confronted with the simultaneous destruction of so much of what they had insured, and a number of them collapsed entirely under the weight of claims they had no possible way of meeting, meaning that a great many property owners who had believed themselves protected against exactly this kind of disaster discovered, in its aftermath, that their protection was worthless, that the company that had promised to make them whole had gone under, and that they had lost not only their property but the security they had paid for to guard against its loss. The economic wound the fire inflicted on Chicago was, in the immediate term, very nearly mortal. And there were serious voices in those first shocked days who wondered aloud whether the city could possibly recover at all, whether the destruction was simply too total, the loss too complete, for Chicago ever to be rebuilt into anything like what it had been. The human toll, the number of people the fire actually killed, is genuinely uncertain, and the uncertainty itself tells us something important about the nature of the disaster and about who tends to be counted and who tends to be forgotten in the aftermath of such events. The figure most commonly cited is that roughly 300 people died in the fire, but this number is, and has always been understood to be, a rough estimate rather than a precise count, and the true figure may well have been higher. The reasons for the uncertainty are grimly familiar from the pattern we have seen in other disasters. The fire moved through some of the poorest and most crowded districts of the city, districts full of recent immigrants and transient laborers and people living on the margins, exactly the kind of people whose deaths were least likely to be formally recorded, who might have no family position to report them missing, whose disappearance in the general chaos might simply go unnoticed and uncounted. The fire also burned with such intensity in places that bodies caught in the worst of it may simply have been consumed beyond any possibility of recovery or identification, leaving no remains to be counted at all. And the sheer scale of the displacement, with 100,000 people scattered across refugee camps and distant towns and the homes of strangers, made any accurate accounting of who had survived and who had not extraordinarily difficult in the immediate aftermath. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the death toll, whatever its exact figure, was strikingly low in proportion to the enormous physical destruction, and this is a genuine and somewhat surprising fact about the disaster that deserves acknowledgement. A fire that destroyed 17,000 buildings and rendered 100,000 people homeless might easily have killed many thousands, and the fact that it apparently killed only a few hundred is, in its narrow way, a piece of real good fortune amid the catastrophe, attributable in large part to the fact that the fire, for all its speed, generally moved slowly enough on the ground and gave enough warning through its glow and its roar that most people were able to flee ahead of it in time. The great exception, the place where people were most likely to be trapped and killed, was in the path of the fire's fastest advances and among those least able to move quickly: the old, the sick, the very young, the drunk, the isolated. And it is among exactly these groups that the uncounted dead, the ones who inflate the true toll above the official figure, are most likely to be found. As with so many disasters, the fire fell hardest on those least equipped to escape it and least likely to be remembered afterward, and the tidy figure of 300 dead almost certainly conceals a larger and sadder reality that the incomplete records of that chaotic aftermath will never fully reveal. Order out of chaos and a general's hard hand. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, with a third of the population homeless and the city's ordinary institutions of government and commerce largely reduced to ash, Chicago faced a crisis of order every bit as urgent as the crisis of shelter and food. The courthouse was gone. The machinery of local government was in disarray. The fire had destroyed police stations and records and the ordinary apparatus of civic authority, and into this vacuum crept the familiar aftershocks of catastrophe. Looting of the ruins, fears of arson and further fires, rumors of roving gangs and criminals descending on the wounded city to prey on its scattered and vulnerable people. Whether these fears were justified in their full extent is a genuine matter of historical debate, and much of the panic about crime and disorder in the days after the fire seems, in hindsight, to have been considerably exaggerated, inflamed by rumor and by the general nervous exhaustion of a traumatized population. But the fear was real, whatever the reality behind it, and the city's authorities responded to it with a decisive and controversial measure. They placed Chicago, or large parts of it, under a form of martial law, and they handed responsibility for maintaining order to the United States Army, in the person of a famous and formidable Civil War general named Philip Sheridan. Sheridan, one of the most celebrated and hard-driving Union commanders of the recent war, happened to be stationed in Chicago, and in the emergency, he took charge of organizing patrols to guard against looting and disorder, drawing on soldiers, on volunteers, and on hastily organized civilian guards to police the ruined districts and the refugee camps. For a period of some weeks, Chicago was effectively under military authority, with armed men patrolling the streets and the camps. And while this arrangement was credited by its defenders with preventing a descent into anarchy and reassuring a frightened population that order would be maintained, it was also, from the beginning, genuinely controversial. And it raised questions that went to the heart of American ideas about civil liberty and the proper limits of military power. The governor of Illinois, among others, objected strenuously to the imposition of what amounted to military rule over an American city in peacetime, without the clear legal authority that such a drastic step would seem to require, and there was real and principled concern that the emergency, however genuine, was being used to justify a suspension of ordinary civilian government that had no proper basis in law. There was, moreover, at least one genuine tragedy that flowed directly from the armed patrolling of the traumatized city, a reminder that placing nervous, armed men in charge of a frightened population is never without its own dangers. A prominent citizen, out among the ruins in the days after the fire, was shot and killed by one of the civilian guards, apparently in a confused and needless encounter, a death that served as a grim illustration of the risks inherent in the whole improvised apparatus of martial order that had been thrown up in the emergency. The episode of military rule in Chicago after the fire was, in the end, relatively brief, and the formal arrangement was wound down after a few weeks as the immediate crisis passed and ordinary civilian authority reasserted itself. But it left behind a genuine unease, a sense that the disaster had, for a time, pushed the city to the edge of abandoning some of its basic principles of self-government, and it stands as a small but real cautionary chapter in the larger story, a reminder that the aftermath of a catastrophe can threaten a community's institutions and values in ways that the catastrophe itself does not. The world sends help. If the aftermath of the fire revealed some of the darker possibilities of catastrophe, the fear and the disorder, and the temptations of arbitrary power, it revealed too, and far more abundantly, one of the more genuinely heartening things human beings are capable of in the face of another's suffering, which is the impulse to help, freely and generously and often at real cost to themselves, people they have never met and will never meet, simply because those people are in desperate need. The news of Chicago's destruction spread across the country and around the world with the speed that the telegraph had recently made possible, and almost as soon as it spread, the aid began to flow, in a wave of generosity that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely extraordinary in its scale and its reach. Cities across the United States organized relief for Chicago with remarkable speed. Trainloads of food, clothing, blankets, tools, building materials, and money poured into the stricken city from every direction, sent by rival cities that might, in ordinary times, have regarded Chicago as a competitor to be undercut rather than a neighbor to be rescued, but that now set aside all such calculation in the face of a disaster that could, everyone understood, have struck any of them just as easily. From the eastern cities came money and manufactured goods. From the western towns came food and lumber. From everywhere came the ordinary necessities that 100,000 suddenly homeless people would need to survive the coming winter. The response was not limited to America either. Word of the disaster crossed the Atlantic, and aid came from abroad as well, from Britain and from the cities of Europe, including, in a gesture that was noted with particular gratitude at the time, a substantial donation of books to help replace those that had been lost, a contribution that would play a real part in the eventual establishment of a great public library in the rebuilt city, so that out of the ashes of a fire that had consumed so much of the printed word in Chicago, there grew, in time, a new institution dedicated to preserving and sharing it. The relief effort within Chicago itself was organized, after some initial chaos, largely through an existing charitable body, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, which took on the enormous task of receiving and distributing the flood of donations and of managing the immediate survival of the displaced population through the difficult months that followed. The Society's work was, by most accounts, reasonably effective at the essential job of keeping people alive and sheltered through the winter, distributing food and clothing and fuel, helping to arrange temporary housing, and providing at least the basic means of survival to a population that had lost everything. But its work was also, like nearly everything about the aftermath, shaped by the attitudes and the prejudices of its time, and the relief effort was administered according to ideas about deservingness and self-reliance and moral character that could be harsh and moralizing in their application, with aid sometimes distributed in ways that reflected judgments about who among the poor was considered worthy of help and who was suspected of trying to take advantage, judgments that fell, predictably, hardest on the very poorest and most marginal of the fire's victims. The generosity that flowed into Chicago was real, and it saved many lives, but it was filtered, as charity so often is, through the assumptions of those doing the giving, and the experience of receiving that charity was not always the experience of simple, unconditional kindness that the scale of the giving might suggest. A hard winter in the ruins. Whatever the complications of the relief effort, the plain fact facing Chicago in the weeks after the fire was that 100,000 people had no homes, and that winter, the hard, cold, brutal winter of the upper Midwest, was coming on fast, and that somehow all of these people would have to be sheltered through it or they would die. The response was a massive and hurried effort to throw up temporary housing. Thousands of small, cheap wooden shelters and barracks and relief structures erected across the city to get people under roofs before the worst of the cold arrived. It is one of the quieter ironies of the aftermath that a city which had just been destroyed by the flammability of its wooden construction immediately set about building thousands of new wooden structures to house its homeless, because wood was, as it had always been, the only material cheap enough and fast enough to meet a need this urgent on this scale, and there was simply no time and no money to shelter 100,000 people in anything more substantial before the snow came. The winter that followed was, by all accounts, a genuinely miserable one for the displaced population of Chicago, huddled in flimsy temporary shelters against the cold, dependent on the charity of the Relief Society for food and fuel, mourning the dead and the lost and the vanished, and facing the daunting, almost unimaginable task of somehow rebuilding lives that had been reduced, in a single night, to ash. And yet, and this is where the story of Chicago begins to turn from catastrophe toward something else, something almost defiant. The remarkable thing about that winter and the spring that followed it was not how many people gave up and left, though certainly some did, but how many stayed, how many looked at the smoking ruin of everything they had built and decided, against what must have seemed like overwhelming odds, to build it all again. Chicago did not, as some had feared and predicted in the first shock days, simply die. It did not empty out and dwindle into a lesser place, a cautionary tale of a boomtown that had burned and never recovered. Instead, almost immediately, with an energy and a confidence that genuinely astonished contemporary observers, it began to rebuild, and the speed and scale of that rebuilding would prove, in the end, to be an even more remarkable story than the fire itself. The city that would not die. There is something almost hard to believe about the speed with which Chicago began to rebuild itself, something that struck people at the time as bordering on the miraculous, and that continues to impress anyone who studies it, and it is worth dwelling on, because it is the part of the story where the disaster stops being merely a tragedy and becomes something stranger and more interesting, a demonstration of the peculiar, stubborn, almost fanatical faith that the people of Chicago had in their own city and its future. The ashes were, in places, quite literally still warm when the first efforts at rebuilding began. Merchants who had lost everything, whose stores and stock and records had all gone up in the flames, put up hastily lettered signs among the ruins announcing that they were still in business, that they would reopen, that they were already taking orders, sometimes conducting trade from temporary shacks thrown up on the very lots where their grand buildings had stood only days before. There is a famous story, quite possibly embellished in the retelling but capturing a genuine truth about the spirit of the moment, of a real estate agent who put up a sign amid the smoking rubble of his office declaring that he had lost everything except his wife, his children, and his energy, and that he was ready to do business again immediately. And whether or not the story is precisely true in its details, it is entirely true in its spirit. Because that attitude, that refusal to be beaten, that almost aggressive determination to rebuild bigger and better and faster than before, was everywhere in Chicago in the months and years after the fire. Within a single year of the disaster, the pace of reconstruction was already staggering. Thousands of new buildings had gone up. The business district was rising again from its ruins. Trade was flowing back through the city, and the population, far from fleeing, was actually growing again as workers poured in to take advantage of the enormous demand for labor that the rebuilding created. Chicago, it turned out, had certain deep advantages that the fire had not touched and could not touch, and these advantages were the real reason the city recovered as it did, the solid foundation beneath the almost boastful confidence of its people. The fire had destroyed the buildings of Chicago, but it had not destroyed, and could not destroy, the things that had made Chicago rich and important in the first place. The railroad still converged on the city. The fire had burned buildings, but the great web of rail lines that made Chicago the crossroads of the continent remained intact, and the trains kept running. The lake and the canal and the river still connected the city to the wider world of trade. The vast agricultural hinterland whose grain and lumber and livestock flowed through Chicago was still there, still producing, still needing exactly the funnel that Chicago provided. The stockyards, located south of the main path of the fire, had largely survived and were soon back at full operation. The fundamental geographic and economic reasons for Chicago's existence and its greatness were entirely untouched by the fire, and as long as those reasons remained, the city had every incentive and every means to rebuild, because the wealth that flowed through it had not gone anywhere. And a city sitting on top of that much opportunity was not going to be allowed to remain in ruins for long. There was also, beyond the cold economic logic, something in the character of the place and its people, something that contemporaries reached for words to describe, and that later became almost a civic myth, a kind of aggressive optimism, a booster spirit, a conviction that Chicago was destined for greatness and that no mere fire, however terrible, was going to stand in the way of that destiny. The city adopted, in the years after the fire, a kind of unofficial motto that captured this spirit perfectly. The simple declaration, "I will," 2 words that expressed, better than any longer statement could, the almost willful, teeth-gritted determination of a city that had looked at its own destruction and decided, more or less immediately, that it would simply refuse to accept it as final. This spirit could be insufferable, no doubt, a booster's bragging and boosterism that outsiders sometimes found tiresome, but it was also, in the aftermath of the fire, genuinely powerful. A self-fulfilling faith that helped drive the extraordinary recovery, because a city that believes absolutely in its own future tends to attract the investment and the labor and the energy that make that future actually happen. Chicago believed in itself with an almost religious intensity in the years after the fire, and that belief, as much as the railroads and the stockyards and the grain, was a real part of why it rose again so fast. Building better, and the birth of the skyscraper. But the most genuinely important legacy of the fire, the thing that would echo far beyond Chicago and reshape cities around the entire world, lay in how Chicago chose to rebuild, in the lessons it drew from its own destruction and the innovations that flowed, directly and indirectly, from the enormous opportunity that a cleared and burned-over Central District presented to a new generation of architects and builders. In the immediate aftermath, there were, as there had been in London 2 centuries before, serious efforts to reform the way the city was built, to ban the reckless wooden construction that had turned a barn fire into a catastrophe, to require brick and stone and fireproof materials, to impose the kind of building regulations that might prevent such a disaster from ever happening again. These efforts met, as such efforts almost always do, with fierce resistance from exactly the quarters one would expect, from working people who could not afford to rebuild their homes in expensive brick, and who saw in the proposed regulations a law that would effectively push the poor out of the rebuilt city. And the politics of fireproofing in post-fire Chicago became a genuine and heated struggle between those who wanted to build the new city safely and those who could not afford to build safely at all. The compromises that resulted were imperfect, and Chicago did not become, overnight, a wholly fireproof city. But over time, the regulations did tighten. The use of the most dangerously flammable construction in the central districts was curtailed, and the city that rose from the ashes was, in its most important commercial core at least, a considerably sturdier and safer thing than the one that had burned. And it was in that rebuilt commercial core, in the decades following the fire, that something genuinely revolutionary happened, something that would change the skyline of every major city on Earth. The fire had cleared away the old low-rise wooden and masonry business district, and the enormous value of the land in the heart of a booming, recovering Chicago created intense pressure to build upward, to get as much rentable space as possible onto each expensive downtown lot. At the same time, a new generation of architects and engineers, drawn to Chicago by the unprecedented opportunity of rebuilding an entire downtown more or less from scratch, were experimenting with new materials and new methods, above all with the use of iron and, soon, steel frames to support buildings, rather than relying on ever thicker masonry walls to bear the load. The combination of these forces, cheap cleared land of enormous value, intense demand for space, a concentration of architectural and engineering talent, and the new structural possibilities of the steel frame, gave birth, in the Chicago of the decades after the fire, to an entirely new kind of building, the tall, steel-framed, fire-proofed commercial tower that we now call the skyscraper. The architects who worked in Chicago in these years, developing what came to be known as the Chicago School of Architecture, pioneered the techniques and the aesthetics that would define the modern high-rise city, And the skyscraper, that most emblematic structure of the modern urban world, was born in significant part out of the opportunity that the Great Fire had, at such terrible cost, created. It is one of the stranger and more profound ironies of the whole story that a disaster caused in large part by the flammable, low-slung, reckless construction of a frontier boomtown should have led, through the rebuilding it forced, to the birth of the fireproof steel tower and the vertical modern city. That out of the ashes of the most spectacular urban fire in American history should have risen, quite literally, the architectural form that would come to symbolize the confidence and the ambition of the entire modern age. The fire nobody remembers. There is a piece of this story that almost always gets left out of the popular telling, and it deserves a place here, both because it is genuinely remarkable in its own right, and because it casts the Chicago fire in a wider and more sobering light, reminding us that the disaster which seized the world's attention was not, on that terrible night, even the deadliest fire burning in America. On the very same evening that the O'Leary barn caught fire in Chicago, some 250 miles to the north, in the pine forests and logging country of northeastern Wisconsin, an infinitely more lethal fire was tearing through the small town of Peshtigo and the surrounding countryside, and it killed, in the space of a single night, far more people than the Great Chicago Fire killed in all its 31 hours of burning. The Peshtigo Fire remains, to this day, the deadliest wildfire in the recorded history of the United States, and it is a genuine and troubling curiosity of history that almost nobody has ever heard of it, that it was so thoroughly overshadowed by the simultaneous disaster in Chicago that it vanished almost entirely from the national memory, even as it was happening. The same conditions that had primed Chicago to burn, the long drought, the tinder dry landscape, the high winds, existed across the entire region that autumn, and in the logging country of Wisconsin, where the ground was littered with the slash and debris of the timber industry, and the forests themselves stood parched and ready to burn. Those conditions produced not a city fire, but a firestorm of almost unimaginable ferocity, a wall of flame that swept out of the forests and engulfed Peshtigo and a number of surrounding settlements with a speed that gave the inhabitants almost no chance to escape. The death toll at Peshtigo has never been established with certainty, for the same reasons the Chicago toll is uncertain: the destruction of records, the transient population, the sheer completeness of the devastation. But the most credible estimates place it somewhere between 1,200 and perhaps 2,500 people killed, and possibly more, a toll that dwarfs the roughly 300 deaths in Chicago and makes Peshtigo, by a wide margin, the greater killer of the two fires that burned that night. The survivors of Peshtigo described scenes of horror that exceeded even the worst of what Chicago endured. A firestorm so intense that it generated tornadoes of flame, that it consumed the oxygen from the air and suffocated people who had not even been touched by the fire itself, that it drove the desperate inhabitants into the river in scenes that echoed the flight to Lake Michigan in Chicago, but with far less chance of survival, as people who plunged into the water to escape the flames drowned or died of exposure in the cold water, or were killed by the intense heat radiating even over the surface of the river. The whole town and much of the surrounding country was simply annihilated, wiped from the map in a single night. And yet, because it happened at the same moment as the fire in the great and famous city to the south, because the telegraph lines were down and the attention of the nation and the world was fixed on Chicago, Peshtigo received only a fraction of the notice and the aid and the memory that its far greater death toll should, by any fair measure, have commanded. There is a lesson buried in the strange twinned fate of these two fires, and it is not a comfortable one. History does not remember disasters in proportion to the suffering they cause. It remembers them in proportion to where they happen, and to whom, and to how well the story of them happens to be told and preserved. A fire that killed perhaps a few hundred people in a great, wealthy, prominent, heavily reported city became one of the most famous disasters in the history of the nation. A byword, a legend, complete with its own mythical cow. A fire that killed many times as many people on the same night, but in a remote logging town far from the centers of attention and wealth and the press, became a footnote, a piece of grim historical trivia that most people have never encountered at all. The people who died at Peshtigo were every bit as real, and their deaths every bit as terrible as the deaths in Chicago, and there were vastly more of them. And yet the world chose, in effect, to remember the smaller disaster and forget the larger one, for reasons that had everything to do with visibility and importance, and nothing whatsoever to do with the actual scale of the human loss. It is worth holding on to that as we return to the story of Chicago, as a small corrective to the natural tendency to assume that the disasters history chooses to remember are the ones that mattered most. Sometimes the greatest catastrophe of a given night is the one that no one remembers at all, the long shadow over Catherine O'Leary. We should return, before we move toward the end of this story, to the woman on DeKoven Street, because her fate after the fire is a part of the story that reflects poorly on the city and the nation that told it, and because a small measure of justice, however belated, was eventually done to her memory, and it is worth recording. Catherine O'Leary, as we have seen, was almost certainly innocent of any responsibility for the fire, the victim of an invented story that a reporter had grafted onto the disaster, and that a prejudiced public had eagerly embraced because it gave them a satisfying villain of exactly the kind they were predisposed to want, a poor Irish Catholic immigrant woman, a member of a group that was, in the America of that era, widely regarded with suspicion and contempt. The legend of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow was not merely a factual error. It was a factual error that drew its power and its staying strength from bigotry, from the willingness of a frightened public to believe the worst about a person who belonged to a despised minority, and the ferocity with which the blame attached itself to her, and the cruelty with which she was treated for the rest of her life, cannot be separated from the anti-Irish and anti-Catholic prejudice that ran deep through the society of her time. She lived out her remaining years, as we have noted, in bitter seclusion, hounded by a notoriety she had never sought and did not deserve, refusing to speak to the endless reporters who sought her out, retreating from a world that had made her a monster, and she died still bearing the blame. And yet the truth, or at least the exoneration, did eventually come, though it came far too late to do her any good. In the years and decades that followed, as historians and investigators looked more carefully at the actual evidence, the case against her steadily dissolved, until it became the settled view of serious students of the fire that she had almost certainly had nothing to do with starting it, that the story of the kicking cow was a fabrication, and that she had been the victim of one of the great injustices of American popular memory. More than a century after the fire, the city of Chicago itself formally took up the question, and its officials publicly and officially exonerated Catherine O'Leary and her cow, clearing their names, at long last, of the blame that had clung to them for generations. It was, of course, a gesture that came far too late to matter to the woman herself, who had been dead for the better part of a century by the time it was made, but it stands as a genuine, if belated, act of historical justice, a formal acknowledgement that the legend had been a lie, and that a real and innocent woman had been grievously wronged by it. And it is worth recording here, because Catherine O'Leary spent her life being blamed for something she did not do, and the least that history can do for her now is to say so, clearly and without qualification, whenever her story is told. What the fire taught about fighting fire. Beyond the rebuilding of the city itself, beyond the birth of the skyscraper and the tightening of building codes, the Great Chicago Fire left another, quieter legacy, one that would spread far beyond Chicago and reshape the way cities across America and around the world defended themselves against exactly this kind of catastrophe. The fire had exposed, with brutal and undeniable clarity, the inadequacy of the way Chicago, and by extension, nearly every American city of the era, had prepared itself to fight fire, and the lessons of that failure, painful as they were to learn, drove real and lasting improvements in firefighting in the decades that followed. We have already seen the catalog of failures that the night revealed. A fire department too small for the city it was meant to protect, exhausted and depleted by the previous night's blaze. An alarm system that failed at the crucial moment, sending the first companies more than a mile astray. A water supply that depended entirely on a single vulnerable pumping station, whose loss doomed every subsequent effort to fight the flames. Each of these failures pointed toward a reform, and in the years after the fire, cities that had watched Chicago burn set about with the particular energy that a well-publicized disaster tends to inspire, addressing exactly these kinds of weaknesses in their own defenses. Fire departments grew larger and more professional, better funded and better equipped, staffed increasingly by full-time paid firefighters rather than the volunteer companies that had defended so many cities in earlier decades. Water systems were designed with more redundancy, with multiple sources and pumping stations, so that the failure of any single point could not leave an entire city defenseless, as the loss of the Chicago waterworks had done. Alarm and communication systems were improved, made more reliable and less dependent on a single watchman's fallible judgment in the dark. And the whole apparatus of urban fire defense, which had been in 1871 a patchy and underfunded afterthought in most American cities, began its long transformation into the professional, well-equipped, carefully organized institution that we now take for granted. A transformation driven in significant part by the searing example of what had happened to Chicago when its own inadequate defenses were put to the ultimate test and found so catastrophically wanting. The insurance industry, too, learned hard lessons from the fire, though the immediate lesson was written in the ruin of the many companies that collapsed under the weight of the Chicago claims. In the longer term, the disaster drove reforms in how insurance companies assessed and priced and spread the risk of fire, how they maintained reserves adequate to survive a catastrophic loss, and how they used their leverage, as insurers had begun to do in England 2 centuries earlier, to push for better building standards and better fire defenses in the cities where they wrote their policies. An insurance company that had just watched an entire portfolio of Chicago property burn to the ground had a powerful financial incentive to ensure that the buildings it insured in the future were built to survive a fire, and the pressure that insurers began to exert in favor of fireproof construction and adequate fire defense became, over time, one of the significant forces driving the improvement of urban safety, a private, profit-driven force working, for its own entirely self-interested reasons, toward the same ends that public regulation was pursuing. There is a pattern here that we have seen before, in the aftermath of the Great Fire of London 2 centuries earlier, and it is worth naming explicitly because it recurs so reliably across the history of disaster that it begins to look like something close to a law of human affairs. Communities, it seems, are very bad at preventing disasters that they can foresee, but have not yet experienced, and very good at reforming themselves once a disaster has actually struck. The warnings that Chicago received before the fire, the newspaper editorials pointing to the drought and the wooden construction and the inadequate defenses, were essentially ignored, as such warnings almost always are, because the cost of acting on them was immediate and certain while the danger they described was hypothetical and deferred. It was only after the danger had made itself horribly real, after the city had actually burned and the bodies had actually been counted and the losses had actually been tallied, that the reforms the warnings had called for became politically possible, that the will to bear the cost of safety finally materialized. This is not exactly a flattering thing to observe about human nature, this consistent inability to act on foreseeable danger until it has become present catastrophe. But it is a true thing, and the Great Chicago Fire is one of its clearest illustrations, a disaster that was predicted, that was preventable, at least in its worst extent, and that was allowed to happen anyway, and that finally taught, through the enormous tuition of its own destruction, the very lessons that had been available for free in the pages of the city's own newspapers in the weeks before it struck. The strange arithmetic of destruction and growth. It is worth pausing here to reflect on one of the genuinely puzzling features of Chicago's recovery, because it complicates the simple, satisfying story of a city rising nobly from its ashes. and forces us to think a little more carefully about what a disaster like this actually does to the place it strikes. The conventional way of telling the story, the way that appeals to our love of redemption and resilience, holds that Chicago was destroyed, and then, through the courage and determination of its people, rebuilt itself even greater than before, so that the fire, terrible as it was, became in the end a kind of dark blessing, the crucible from which a greater city emerged. And there is real truth in this. Chicago did recover with astonishing speed, and it did go on to become a far larger and grander city in the decades after the fire than it had been before, and the birth of the skyscraper and the modern building codes and the professionalized fire defenses were all genuine goods that flowed from the rebuilding. But we should be careful and honest about the limits of this redemptive reading, because it can slide too easily into the comforting but false conclusion that the fire was, on balance, good for Chicago, that the destruction was somehow worth it for the greater city that followed. This is almost certainly not true, and the reason it is not true is subtle but important. Chicago was already growing explosively before the fire, already becoming one of the great cities of the world, already destined, by virtue of its geography and its railroads and its position at the throat of a continent, for enormous growth. The fire did not create that trajectory. The trajectory existed independently of the fire and would have continued without it. What the fire did was destroy an enormous amount of accumulated wealth and kill several hundred people and inflict immense suffering on 100,000 more. And then the city, drawing on the same fundamental advantages it had always possessed, resumed the growth it had been enjoying all along. The greater Chicago that emerged in the decades after the fire was not greater because of the fire. It was greater because Chicago was going to become greater anyway, and the fire was a terrible, costly interruption of that growth rather than a cause of it. The rebuilding was heroic, and the innovations that came out of it were real. But they were, in the largest accounting, the recovery of ground that had been lost, not a net gain, and the several hundred people who died and the vast wealth that burned were simply gone, a pure loss that no amount of subsequent growth could ever truly repay or justify. This matters, this careful distinction between recovery and benefit, because the redemptive myth of the fire, the story of the phoenix rising from the ashes, however inspiring, can subtly excuse or minimize the real catastrophe at the heart of the story, can turn a genuine tragedy into a kind of uplifting fable in which the suffering becomes merely the necessary prelude to a triumphant recovery. The truer and harder reading is that the fire was a disaster, full stop, an enormous and largely preventable destruction of life and wealth and irreplaceable things, and that Chicago's recovery, magnificent as it was the story of a city overcoming that disaster rather than being improved by it. The people of Chicago deserve enormous credit for the way they rebuilt their city, but the fire itself deserves no credit at all, and we do the victims a quiet disservice if we allow the genuine inspiration of the recovery to soften our judgment of the catastrophe that made the recovery necessary in the first place, the city on the eve. It helps, before we let the story settle toward its close, to picture more fully the Chicago that the fire destroyed, to fill in the ordinary texture of daily life in that lost city, because the disaster did not simply consume buildings, it interrupted and in many cases ended lives that had been going about their ordinary business right up until the moment the flames arrived, and the human weight of the catastrophe is easier to feel when we can picture the world it swallowed. Chicago in the autumn of 1871 was, for all its rawness and its mud and its reckless wooden construction, a genuinely exhilarating place to be alive, a city crackling with energy and ambition and money, and the particular optimism of a place that knows it is on its way up in the world. It was young, astonishingly young, a city that had barely existed within the living memory of its older residents, and that had grown so fast that a great many of the people walking its streets in 1871 could remember when it had been a fraction of its current size, could remember the muddy village it had been before the railroads came and the money started flowing. The population was overwhelmingly a population of newcomers, immigrants and migrants drawn to the booming city from every direction, from the farms and small towns of the American interior, and above all from across the Atlantic. from Ireland and from the German states and from Scandinavia and from a dozen other origins, so that the streets of Chicago rang with a babel of languages, and the city was divided, in the informal way that immigrant cities always are, into neighborhoods and districts where one group or another predominated. The Irish here, the Germans there, the native-born Americans in their own quarters, each community with its own churches and taverns and newspapers and mutual aid societies, each finding its own foothold in the roaring, chaotic, opportunity-filled city. The O'Learys and their neighbors on DeKoven Street were part of this vast immigrant influx, part of the Irish working-class community that had come to Chicago in search of the work that its explosive growth so abundantly provided, and their small wooden cottages and their kept cows and their milk sold to the neighbors were entirely typical of the modest, striving, precarious lives that the great majority of Chicago's people actually lived, far from the wealth and grandeur of the business district and the mansions of the elite. The work of the city was the work of moving and processing the wealth of a continent, and it was hard, physical, often dangerous work, done by the tens of thousands of laborers who loaded and unloaded the endless freight trains, who worked the grain elevators and the lumber yards and the killing floors of the stockyards, who built, with their own hands, the wooden city that was about to burn. Above them, in the social order of the place, stood the merchants and the traders and the businessmen who bought and sold the grain and the lumber and the livestock, who ran the banks and the insurance companies and the great commercial houses of the business district, and who had grown, many of them, enormously wealthy on the commerce that flowed through the city, building the grand buildings downtown and the fine homes on the fashionable avenues that the fire would shortly consume, along with everything else. And threaded through all of it, binding the whole restless enterprise together, was the particular culture of a boomtown. The taverns and the theaters and the gambling houses and the vice districts. The newspapers with their boosterism and their scandal and their relentless promotion of the city's greatness. The churches and the reformers preaching against the wickedness of it all. The whole loud, striving, contradictory, intensely alive culture of a young city convinced of its own destiny and in a tremendous hurry to fulfill it. This was the world that the fire interrupted, and it is worth remembering, when we tally the 17,000 buildings and the 100,000 made homeless and the several hundred dead, that each of those numbers stands for a piece of this living world, a home where a family had made its life, a business built up over years of labor, a person with a name and a history and people who loved them. The fire did not fall on an abstraction. It fell on a real and particular and vividly alive city, on the Irish milkmaids and the German laborers and the Yankee merchants and the newspaper boys and the tavern keepers and the churchgoers and all the rest of the vast human variety that a great immigrant boomtown contains, and it upended in a single night. The ordinary lives that all of these people had been living right up until the moment the flames came for them. That is the true measure of the catastrophe. Not the buildings and the dollars, terrible as those losses were, but the interruption and in too many cases the ending of ordinary human lives that had been unfolding, full of their own hopes and troubles and plans, in a city that had every reason to believe it would go on standing forever, hour by hour through the longest night. It is worth walking through the actual timeline of the disaster once more, slowly and in order, because the sequence of it, the way one thing led to another across those 31 hours, reveals the terrible logic by which a small barn fire became a citywide catastrophe, and the several distinct moments at which a different turn might have changed everything. The fire began, as we have seen, in the O'Leary barn on the west side, sometime in the mid-evening of Sunday, October the 8th, probably somewhere around 9 o'clock. In those first minutes, it was nothing more than a barn fire, dangerous but ordinary. The kind of thing the city dealt with routinely. Had the alarm reached the fire department quickly and accurately, had the first companies arrived promptly at the actual scene, the fire might well have been contained to the O'Leary property and a few neighboring lots, and this story would never have been told. But the alarm did not reach the department quickly and accurately. The watchman misjudged the location. The first companies were sent astray. The correction was fumbled and delayed. And in the time it took to sort out the confusion, The fire, driven by the wind, grew from a barn fire into a neighborhood fire, spreading through the dry wooden cottages and sheds and fences of the west side faster than the belatedly arriving firefighters could hope to contain. Through the late evening of Sunday, the fire consumed the west side district where it had begun and pushed steadily northeast toward the river, and it was during these hours that the last real chance of containing it slipped away, as the fire grew too large for the exhausted and undersized department to master, and began throwing its burning brands ahead on the wind, planting new fires faster than they could be fought. Around midnight, or in the hours just after, the fire made the leap that so many had hoped was impossible, crossing the south branch of the river and establishing itself in the districts beyond. And from that moment, the destruction of the business district became, in effect, inevitable. Through the small hours of Monday morning, the fire tore through the commercial heart of the city, consuming the banks and hotels and stores and offices, bringing down the courthouse with its tolling bell, and, in the single most catastrophic stroke of the entire disaster, reaching and destroying the waterworks, cutting off the water on which every hope of fighting the fire depended, and transforming the catastrophe from something that might still be fought into something that could only be endured. Through the rest of Monday, with the water gone and the department broken, the fire crossed yet another branch of the river and swept into the north side, burning through its vast residential districts with a thoroughness that left almost nothing standing, driving the last great wave of refugees before it toward the northern edges of the city and the shore of the lake. And then, late on Monday night and into the small hours of Tuesday, having burned for the better part of a full day and night, the fire finally began to falter, as the wind eased and the fuel thinned at the city's edges and, at last, the rain began to fall, until by Tuesday the great fire was out, drowned by the weather after 31 hours of burning. Walk through that sequence, and you can see the several hinges on which the whole disaster turned: the misjudged alarm, the leap across the river, the loss of the waterworks. And you can see, too, that at each of these hinges the outcome was decided not by any grand or dramatic cause, but by the small workings of chance and human error and the merciless indifference of the wind, the ordinary raw material out of which the largest catastrophes, in the end, are always assembled. How the story survived. It is worth saying a brief word about how we actually know all of this, about how the story of a single chaotic night in 1871 has come down to us in such detail, because the survival of the story is itself a part of the story, and it explains some of the peculiar shape that our memory of the fire has taken. Unlike the Great Fire of London, whose vivid human detail depended so heavily on the private diaries of a few men and lay locked in unreadable shorthand for over a century, the Great Chicago Fire happened in a modern, thoroughly documented age, in a city full of newspapers and letter writers, and, crucially, at a moment when the technologies of mass communication were spreading the news of it across the world, almost as it happened. The result is that we have an enormous wealth of first-hand material about the fire: letters and diaries and memoirs by the hundreds, newspaper accounts, official reports and investigations, and even, remarkably, photographs. Images of the ruins taken in the aftermath that let us see, with our own eyes, the field of toppled walls and lone chimneys that the fire left behind, a kind of documentary evidence that no earlier disaster of comparable scale could offer. But the very richness of the record carries its own dangers, and the history of how the fire has been remembered is, in significant part, a history of the struggle to separate the true from the false, the documented from the invented, in a flood of material that mixed careful eyewitness testimony with rumor, exaggeration, sensationalism, and outright fabrication. The tale of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, as we have seen, was a pure invention that nonetheless became, for most people, the single best-known fact about the fire, a piece of fiction that outran and very nearly buried the truth. And it was far from the only one. The chaotic, terrifying, poorly understood nature of the disaster made it fertile ground for the growth of legends and myths of every kind, Stories of heroism and villainy and strange happenings that spread through the traumatized population and into the newspapers, and from there into the permanent popular memory of the event. Some of them true, many of them embellished, and a fair number of them entirely made up. The historian's task, in reconstructing what actually happened, has been in large part the task of clearing away this accumulated overgrowth of legend to find the more sober and often less dramatic truth beneath. And it is a task that remains, in some respects, unfinished, because some of the myths, the cow chief among them, have proven so durable, so deeply embedded in the popular imagination, that no amount of careful historical correction seems quite able to dislodge them. There is a broader lesson in this too, about the way that catastrophes are remembered, about the gap that so often opens between what actually happened and the story that a shocked and grieving public tells itself about what happened. People confronted with a disaster of overwhelming scale, a disaster that seems too large and too senseless to comprehend, reach instinctively for stories that make it comprehensible, that give it a shape and a cause and, above all, a human meaning. And those stories, once they take hold, can prove far more powerful and far more lasting than the messy, ambiguous, often anticlimactic truth. The truth of the Chicago fire is that a barn caught fire for reasons nobody knows, in a city that had recklessly made itself into a fire trap, on a night when the wind and the drought and a series of small human failures happened to align in exactly the wrong way, and that this ordinary chain of accident and negligence produced an extraordinary catastrophe. That is a true story, but it is not a very satisfying one, and so the public reached instead for the cow, for the clumsy immigrant woman and her lantern, for a story with a villain and a clear cause and a human face. And that story, false as it was, became the one that everyone remembered. It is the same instinct that had, 2 centuries earlier, hanged an innocent watchmaker for the Great Fire of London. The same deep human need to find a someone to blame, rather than to accept the harder truth of blameless catastrophe. And it produced, in Chicago as in London, a lasting injustice done to an innocent person in the service of a comforting lie, the fire in the American memory. The Great Chicago Fire occupies a peculiar and revealing place in the memory of the United States, and it is worth reflecting on what that place tells us, both about the fire and about the nation that has chosen to remember it in the particular way it has. For most Americans, the fire is remembered, if it is remembered at all, as a kind of colorful historical anecdote, a story about a cow that kicked over a lantern and burned down a city, a piece of folklore more than a genuine historical catastrophe. Its real horror and its real death toll and its real human cost largely forgotten beneath the cartoonish charm of the legend. This is, in its way, a strange fate for a disaster of such magnitude, and it stands in sharp contrast to the way that some other American catastrophes have been remembered, with solemnity and mourning and a clear sense of tragedy. The fire, somehow, became instead a kind of tall tale, a bit of frontier humor. Its victims and its terror dissolved into the amiable legend of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, and there is something genuinely troubling in that, in the way that a catastrophe which killed hundreds and ruined thousands could be transmuted, over time, into a light-hearted story that most people find more amusing than horrifying. Part of the explanation, surely, lies in the redemptive myth of the recovery, in the fact that Chicago rebuilt itself so quickly and so triumphantly that the fire came to be remembered less as a tragedy than as the dramatic prelude to an inspiring comeback. The dark first act of a story whose ending was so happy that it retroactively lightened the horror of the beginning. A disaster that a city recovers from magnificently is easier to remember with a smile than a disaster that leaves only ruin. And Chicago's astonishing rebound made it possible to fold the fire into a fundamentally optimistic national narrative, a story of American resilience and enterprise, and the indomitable spirit of a great city refusing to be beaten. There is truth in that narrative, and it is not wrong to find the recovery inspiring. But there is also, in the cheerful way the fire is so often remembered, a kind of forgetting, a quiet erasure of the real suffering at its heart. And it is worth resisting that erasure, worth insisting, even as we admire the recovery, on remembering the fire for what it actually was, a genuine catastrophe that fell on real people and caused real and irreversible harm, and not merely as the amusing origin story of a Phoenix city and its legendary bovine arsonist. The monuments and the marks. Chicago has not entirely forgotten the fire, of course, and the city carries, in various ways, the marks and memorials of the disaster that so nearly destroyed it. The site of the O'Leary property on DeKoven Street, where it all began, is today occupied, in a stroke of irony so perfect it seems almost designed, by a training academy for firefighters, so that the very ground where the great fire started is now dedicated to teaching the men and women who will fight the fires of the future. A quiet and fitting transformation of the place, from the birthplace of catastrophe into a school for its prevention. There is a sculpture there, a memorial to the fire, and there are scattered other markers and monuments around the city, and there are the handful of buildings that survived the fire and still stand. The famous old water tower on the north side chief among them, a sturdy stone structure that came through the flames and endured, and that has served ever since as a kind of symbol of the city's survival. A piece of the old Chicago that the fire could not destroy, standing still amid the towers of the new city that rose around it. But the greatest monument to the fire is not any single marker or memorial. It is the city itself, the vast, dense, vertical modern metropolis that rose from the ashes and that carries, in its very form and fabric, the legacy of the disaster that cleared the ground for it. The skyscrapers of Chicago, the fireproof steel-framed towers that the architects of the Chicago School pioneered in the decades after the fire, are, in a real sense, the children of the catastrophe, born of the opportunity and the necessity that the fire created. And every one of them stands as a kind of testament, however unintended, to the strange, generative destruction of that October night. The building codes that keep the modern city safe, the professional fire departments that guard it, the whole apparatus of urban fire safety that we now take entirely for granted, all of it traces back, in part, to the lessons written in the ruins of 1871. And in that sense, the fire is memorialized, not in stone or bronze, but in the very safety and solidity of the modern cities that learned from it. An invisible monument built into the structure of urban life itself. The last watch of the night. There is one more thing worth reflecting on before we let this story finally rest. One more thread that runs through the whole of it, and that gives it, perhaps, its deepest meaning. And it is the thread of foreseeability, of the terrible recurring pattern by which communities build the conditions of their own catastrophes in plain sight and then act surprised when the catastrophe arrives. Chicago did not burn because of a cow, and it did not burn really because of a barn fire, or a dry wind, or a misjudged alarm, though all of these played their part. Chicago burned because it had spent decades building itself, recklessly and in full view of anyone who cared to look, into a vast structure of dry timber packed tightly together because it had ignored, year after year, the mounting warnings about its own vulnerability, because it had chosen, as communities so reliably choose, the immediate savings of cheap wooden construction over the deferred and uncertain cost of building safely, and because it had failed to provide itself with fire defenses adequate to the danger it had created. The barn fire was merely the spark. The catastrophe had been assembled, piece by careless piece, over the whole course of the city's short and frantic history, and it was waiting only for the spark to arrive. This is the pattern that recurs, with a regularity that ought to alarm us more than it does, across the whole history of human disaster, from the Great Fire of London to the Great Chicago Fire, and onward through a long catalog of catastrophes that were foreseen and preventable, and allowed to happen anyway. Communities are, it seems, almost constitutionally incapable of paying the certain immediate cost of preventing a disaster that remains, for the moment, hypothetical. And it is only after the disaster has actually struck, Only after the cost has been paid in the far more terrible currency of death and destruction that the will to reform finally materializes. There is a genuine and sobering lesson in this, a lesson that reaches far beyond the specific matter of fire safety, and it is worth carrying away from this story into the wider world. This uncomfortable awareness that the warnings we ignore today, the risks we choose not to bear the cost of preventing because they have not yet made themselves real, are the raw material of the catastrophes of tomorrow, and that the people of Chicago in 1871, reading the newspaper warnings about their fire trap of a city and setting them aside because there was business to attend to and the fire had not happened yet, were not fools or villains, but simply ordinary human beings behaving in the ordinary human way. The same way we ourselves behave, every day, toward the foreseeable dangers we have decided, for now, not to think about. The unequal fire. There is a dimension of this story that the redemptive telling tends to pass over quickly, and it deserves a fuller reckoning, because a disaster of this kind never falls evenly on the people it strikes, and the Great Chicago Fire, like nearly every catastrophe before and since, fell hardest on those least able to bear it, and recovered most generously the fortunes of those who had the most to begin with. The fire, in its physical progress, destroyed the mansions of the wealthy North Side, alongside the cottages of the poor, and in that narrow sense it was indiscriminate, consuming the grand and the humble with the same blind hunger. But the experience of the fire, and above all the experience of its aftermath, was anything but equal, and the story of who suffered most and who recovered fastest is a story shaped at every turn by the divisions of class and wealth and ethnicity that ran through the city before the fire, and that the fire, far from erasing, in many ways sharpened and exposed. Consider what the fire actually cost, and to whom. A wealthy merchant who lost a grand home and a thriving business in the fire lost a very great deal, in absolute terms. But he was also, very often, a man with resources beyond the burned property itself, with savings and investments and credit and connections, with the means to rebuild and the standing to command the labor and the materials and the loans that rebuilding required. Such men, many of them, were back in business within months, their fortunes dented but their fundamental positions secure, and some of them, positioned to profit from the enormous demand of the reconstruction, actually emerged from the disaster richer than they had entered it. A poor laborer who lost a small wooden cottage, by contrast, lost, in absolute terms, far less. But he very often lost, in proportion to what he had, very nearly everything, the whole of his modest accumulated wealth, the home that had represented years of scrimping and saving, and he had, unlike the wealthy merchant, no reserves to fall back on, no investments to draw down, no credit to command, nothing but his own labor and whatever charity the Relief Society saw fit to extend to him. The same fire that was a costly setback for the rich was, for the poor, an outright catastrophe from which many of them never fully recovered, and the tidy accounting of total dollars lost conceals this brutal inequality of impact. The way the same physical event visited a manageable misfortune on some and an unmanageable ruin on others, according entirely to how much cushion each had possessed before the flames arrived. The relief effort, as we've already glimpsed, reflected and in some ways reinforced these inequalities rather than softening them. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society, which took charge of distributing the flood of donated aid, administered it according to the prevailing ideas of the era about deservingness and moral character and the dangers of encouraging dependency among the poor, ideas that led it to scrutinize the recipients of aid with a suspicious and moralizing eye, to worry more about the possibility of the undeserving poor taking advantage of charity than about the possibility of the deserving poor being denied help they desperately needed. Aid was distributed unevenly and often grudgingly to the working class and immigrant victims of the fire, hedged about with conditions and judgments and investigations into whether a given family was truly worthy of assistance, while the machinery of recovery worked far more smoothly and generously for those higher up the social scale. There was, in the administration of the relief, a persistent thread of the assumption that the poor were poor through some fault of their own, and that too much charity would only make them lazier and more dependent, an assumption that fell with particular weight on the Irish and other immigrant communities who made up so much of the fire's most vulnerable victims, and that ensured that the generosity which flowed into Chicago from around the world was filtered before it reached the neediest, through a mesh of class prejudice and moral suspicion that significantly diminished its benefit to exactly those who needed it most. There is, in all of this, a pattern that should by now feel wearily familiar. The pattern by which a disaster that appears, on its surface, to strike a whole community equally, in fact deepens and hardens the divisions that ran through that community all along, sparing the powerful their worst consequences and visiting the full weight of the catastrophe on the powerless. The Great Chicago Fire did not dissolve the class distinctions of the city in some grand democratic leveling. It enforced them cruelly in the differential experience of loss and recovery, and the Chicago that rose from the ashes, for all its energy and its innovation and its inspiring resilience, rose in a way that largely preserved and in some respects intensified the inequalities of the city that had burned. This is worth remembering, alongside the genuine achievements of the recovery, because a clear-eyed account of the disaster must include not only the heroism and the rebuilding, but also the quieter, uglier truth of who paid the highest price for a catastrophe they had done nothing to cause, and who was left when the grand new city rose glittering from the ruins, still struggling in its shadow, a note on the wind, and on luck. We have returned, again and again throughout this story, to the wind, and it is worth pausing near the end to reflect properly on the role that pure chance played in the disaster, because it is easy, in reconstructing a catastrophe after the fact, to fall into a kind of false determinism, to make the whole thing seem, in retrospect, inevitable, the certain product of all the conditions that had assembled to produce it. The wooden city, the drought, the exhausted department, the inadequate defenses, all of these were real, and all of them made a great fire more likely, and it is fair to say that Chicago in 1871 was an accident waiting to happen. But there is a difference between an accident waiting to happen and an accident that necessarily happens on a particular night in a particular way with a particular catastrophic result. And the difference between those two things is, in very large part, luck, the specific and unrepeatable alignment of chance factors that turned one barn fire among the many that Chicago suffered that dry autumn into the Great Chicago Fire. Think of how many things had to go wrong, and go wrong together, for the catastrophe to unfold as it did. The fire had to start on a night when the wind was blowing hard and steady from exactly the direction that would carry it into the heart of the city. It had to start on a night when the department was exhausted and depleted from the previous evening's fire. The alarm had to fail, the watchman had to guess wrong, the first companies had to be sent astray. The fire had to reach the river at a point, and in a manner that allowed it to leap across, rather than being stopped. And most fatefully of all, a single burning brand out of the countless thousands thrown up by the fire had to land on the roof of the one building in the entire city whose loss would doom all the rest. The waterworks, at the one moment when its loss would be most catastrophic. Change any one of these, give Chicago a still night, or a rested department, or an accurate alarm, or a waterworks that survived a few hours longer, and the fire might have been a serious blaze that burned a district and was remembered, if at all, as a bad night, rather than the civilization-altering catastrophe it became. The conditions made a great fire possible, even likely, but it was luck, bad luck of a very specific and concentrated kind, that made this particular great fire actual, that assembled on this particular night. The exact chain of misfortunes required to burn a city to the ground. This matters, this proper acknowledgement of the role of chance, because it guards us against two opposite errors, both of which distort our understanding of the disaster. The first error is to attribute the catastrophe entirely to blame, to human failure and negligence, to the exhausted firefighters, or the hesitant officials, or the reckless builders, or, most unjustly of all, to Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, as though the disaster were simply the deserved consequence of somebody's fault. This is unfair, because while human failures certainly contributed, no one of them, and not even all of them together, made the catastrophe inevitable. It took the additional, unearned misfortune of the wind and the brand and the timing to turn failure into catastrophe. The second and opposite error is to attribute the catastrophe entirely to fate, to treat it as a pure act of God or nature that no human decision could have affected, as though the wooden city and the inadequate defenses were irrelevant and only the wind mattered. This too is false, because the conditions that human beings had created were exactly what allowed the bad luck to have such catastrophic consequences. The same wind and the same brand falling on a well-built, well-defended city of brick and stone would have done far less harm. The truth lies in the uncomfortable space between blame and fate, in the recognition that the disaster was the product of both, of human failures that created the conditions and of chance that pulled the trigger, and that neither the failures nor the luck alone would have been sufficient, and that it took the terrible collaboration of the two to produce the catastrophe that history remembers. Small lives in a great fire. Let us return, for a while, to the individual human experience of that night, because the sweep of a citywide catastrophe can flatten the particular terror of it into something abstract and statistical, and it is worth resisting that flattening, worth remembering that the fire was lived, in the end, not as a single great event, but as tens of thousands of separate particular ordeals, each one endured by a specific person in a specific place, with a specific set of terrors and choices and losses. The accounts that survive are full of such particular moments, and they are worth dwelling on, because they return to the disaster the human scale that the numbers strip away. There were the parents who became separated from their children in the smoke and the crush of the fleeing crowds, and who spent the night and the days afterward in an agony of searching, moving through the refugee camps and the makeshift shelters, calling out names, checking the lists of the found and the dead, living through hours and sometimes days of not knowing whether their child was alive or dead or lost forever in the chaos, an anguish that some of them had resolved in joyful reunion and others carried, unresolved, for the rest of their lives. There were the elderly and the infirm, who could not flee quickly enough on their own, and who depended entirely on others to carry them to safety, and who were, in some cases, carried by sons and daughters and neighbors and even strangers who would not leave them behind, and in other cases, terribly, were left behind in the impossible calculus of a panicked escape, and who number, almost certainly, among the uncounted dead. There were the sick, dragged from their beds and hauled through the streets ahead of the flames, and the newborn infants carried through the smoke by mothers who had given birth only days before, and the whole vast range of human vulnerability that a great city contains, all of it thrown, without warning or mercy, into the middle of a burning night, and forced to survive as best it could. There were moments of strange, almost dreamlike incongruity that lodged in the memories of those who witnessed them, the sort of details that the mind fixes on precisely because they are so out of place amid the horror. People remembered a piano, somehow dragged out into the street and abandoned there, standing incongruously amid the fleeing crowds. People remembered caged birds carried carefully to safety while fortunes burned. People remembered the animals of the city, the horses and dogs and cattle, driven mad with terror by the fire, running loose through the streets, and the particular horror of animals trapped and unable to flee, the cows in the burning barns, the horses in the burning stables. People remembered the way the intense heat did strange things to the materials of the city, melting glass and metal, warping iron, and they remembered picking through the ruins afterward and finding these transformed objects, a fused lump that had been a set of dishes, a twisted mass that had been a stove, the physical evidence of temperatures beyond anything they had ever imagined, preserved in the cooled and solidified wreckage of their former lives. And there were, threaded through all the terror and the loss, the small, persistent acts of ordinary human decency and ordinary human absurdity that seemed to survive even the worst of catastrophes. The neighbors who shared what little they had saved, the strangers who took in the homeless, the shopkeepers who gave away their goods rather than see them burn, and also the looters and the profiteers and the drunks. The whole familiar range of how people behave when the ordinary rules are suspended and the world is on fire. One of the enduring impressions that emerges from the mass of survivor accounts is simply how ordinary people remained even in the midst of the extraordinary. How they carried their particular personalities and their particular concerns and their particular small human foolishnesses right into the heart of the disaster, saving the wrong things, worrying about the wrong things, behaving, in short, exactly like themselves, like human beings rather than like the noble or villainous archetypes that a more sentimental telling might make of them. The fire did not transform the people of Chicago into heroes or monsters. It caught them as they were, ordinary people living ordinary lives, and it forced them to endure an extraordinary night as best their ordinary selves could manage. And most of them, remarkably, endured it, and went on, and rebuilt and lived. The sensory memory of the fire. If you ask what it was actually like, physically, to be there, to stand in the streets of Chicago on that burning night, the survivor accounts return again and again to a handful of overwhelming sensory impressions. And it is worth gathering them together, because they convey, better than any analysis, the sheer visceral reality of the experience. The way the fire assaulted every sense at once and imprinted itself on the memory of everyone who lived through it. There was, first and above all, the sound, which nearly every account dwells on, the enormous, continuous, all-enveloping roar of the fire, a sound that people compared to a great cataract, to a hurricane, to the sustained thunder of a battle, a noise so loud and so constant that it made ordinary speech impossible and drowned out. Even the screams and shouts of the fleeing crowds, punctuated only by the sharper sounds that rose above it, the crash of collapsing buildings, the shattering of glass, the occasional deeper concussion of some store of flammable material igniting all at once. To be in the fire was to be inside that sound, to have it press against the ears and fill the whole world, and survivors remembered it, years later, as one of the most unforgettable features of the entire ordeal. There was the heat, which grew, in the districts nearest the main body of the fire, to an intensity that defied description. A heat that could be felt at a startling distance, that blistered exposed skin and singed hair, and made the very act of breathing painful as the superheated air seared the throat and lungs. People fleeing the fire spoke of running with their faces turned away and shielded, of the heat pressing physically against their backs like a great hand pushing them forward, of clothing beginning to smolder and hair beginning to singe from heat alone, without any direct contact with flame. There was the smoke, thick and black and choking, that stung the eyes and clawed at the lungs and reduced visibility, in places, to almost nothing, so that people fled half-blind through streets they could barely see, guided as much by the roar of the fire behind them and the press of the crowd around them as by any clear sight of where they were going. There was the light, the lurid, unnatural orange and red glow that turned night into a hellish day, bright enough, by many accounts, to read by, casting everything in the strange, flickering, shadowless illumination of a world entirely lit by fire. And there was the falling debris, the constant rain of sparks and burning embers and glowing brands that showered down out of the sky, that landed on clothes and hair and rooftops, that had to be brushed away and beaten out continuously, that made the very air seem to be raining fire. To gather these impressions together, the deafening roar, the searing heat, the choking smoke, the hellish light, the raining fire, is to begin, faintly, to imagine what it must have been like to be there, to be one of the 100,000 people driven from their homes into that inferno. And it is worth making the effort of that imagination, because it is the only way to truly understand what the dry numbers of the disaster actually meant to the people who lived through them. Behind every one of the 17,000 destroyed buildings, behind every one of the 100,000 made homeless, behind every one of the several hundred dead, there was an experience like this. A night spent inside that overwhelming sensory nightmare. A night of the roar and the heat and the smoke and the light and the falling fire. And to remember the fire properly is to remember not just what it destroyed, but what it was like to be caught inside it. The actual lived texture of the worst night in the history of a great city. What the fire actually built. It is worth being genuinely honest as we approach the end about what the Great Chicago Fire did and did not accomplish, in the same clear-eyed way that any historical catastrophe deserves to be assessed once enough time has passed to see it whole. The fire did not, despite the myths that have grown up around it, make Chicago great. Chicago was already becoming great, and would have become great without the fire, which interrupted rather than caused the city's rise. The fire did not fall equally on the people of Chicago. It spared the powerful their worst consequences and visited its full weight on the poor and the vulnerable and the immigrant communities least able to bear it. And the recovery, magnificent as it was, largely preserved and in some ways deepened the inequalities of the city that had burned. The fire did not, in any simple sense, teach the city to build safely. The reforms it prompted were fiercely contested, imperfectly implemented, and shaped as much by the interests of the powerful as by any pure commitment to safety. And Chicago did not become, overnight or perhaps ever, the wholly fireproof city that the disaster might, in a more perfect world, have inspired. And the fire, of course, in the most brutal and literal sense, failed entirely to protect the very people who lived through it, killing an unknown but significant number of them, ruining the modest fortunes of tens of thousands more, and inflicting a night of terror and a lifetime of loss on a whole generation of Chicagoans who had done nothing to deserve it. And yet something did change, and change genuinely for the better, in ways that were real even if they were rarely as clean or as complete as the redemptive myth would have them. Out of the rebuilding came the skyscraper and the Chicago School of Architecture and the whole revolution in urban building that would reshape cities around the world. A genuine and lasting contribution to human civilization that flowed, however indirectly, from the terrible opportunity the fire created. Out of the disaster came real, if imperfect, improvements in building codes and fire defenses and urban water systems, not just in Chicago, but in the many cities that watched Chicago burn and resolved not to share its fate, so that the lessons of the fire, paid for at such cost by the people of one city, became a kind of dark gift to countless other cities that never had to burn to learn them. Out of the ashes came a great public library, built in part from the books that a sympathetic world had sent, so that a fire which had destroyed so much of the printed word in Chicago gave rise, in time, to a new institution dedicated to preserving it. And out of the whole ordeal came something less tangible but no less real, a demonstration, for whatever it is worth, of the sheer stubborn resilience of a human community determined not to be destroyed, the spectacle of 100,000 homeless people and a ruined city refusing to give up, rebuilding against the odds and the winter and the despair, the lives and the city that the fire had taken from them. None of it was worth the fire. That is the essential thing to hold on to, the thing that the redemptive myth is always tempted to forget. The skyscrapers and the building codes and the library and the inspiring recovery were not worth the several hundred lives that the fire took, or the suffering it inflicted, or the irreplaceable things it destroyed. No amount of subsequent good could ever balance that account, and it is a kind of moral error to imagine that it could. But it is also true, and worth saying, that the people of Chicago, faced with a catastrophe they had not chosen and could not undo, made of its aftermath something genuinely remarkable, that they took the ruin the fire had left them and built from it, through nothing more than their own stubborn labor and their own refusal to be beaten, a city greater and safer and more enduring than the one that had burned. The fire deserves no credit for that. The people do. And perhaps that is the truest and most human lesson of the whole story, that catastrophe, when it comes, as it always eventually comes, is not the end of the story, but the beginning of another one. The story of what the survivors choose to do with what they have left, and that in the space between the disaster and the recovery lies the whole of what is worst and what is best in human nature. The failure and the folly that let the catastrophe happen, and the courage and the stubbornness that refused to let it be the final word. That brings us to the end of our story, and to the quiet hours when the fires have long since gone entirely cold, when the towers of the rebuilt city stand tall and lit against the night sky over a Lake Michigan shore where, on one terrible October night a century and a half ago, thousands of frightened people once stood waist-deep in the cold water and watched their world burn. The barn on DeKoven Street where it all began, the exhausted firefighters who fought a losing battle through the longest of nights. The watchman in his tower squinting into the smoky dark and guessing wrong. The innocent woman blamed for generations for a fire she almost certainly had nothing to do with. The 100,000 made homeless and the several hundred who did not survive. And the stubborn, defiant, almost unreasonable determination of a wounded city that looked at its own ashes and simply refused to stay down. All of it has slipped quietly, gently, into the deep and settled past. Remembered now, if it is remembered at all, mostly through the amiable legend of a cow that never kicked a lantern at all. There is a kind of peace in that, in the way that even the greatest catastrophes eventually soften into history, lose their terror and their grief, become stories told in the dark to help restless people fall asleep. The people who lived through that night are all gone now, every one of them. Their fear and their loss and their courage carried with them into the same silence that eventually claims us all. And the city they rebuilt has gone on standing and growing and changing for a century and a half since, its people mostly untroubled by the memory of the fire that so nearly destroyed everything, going about their ordinary lives on the same streets, above the same buried ashes, under the same wide sky. That is how it always goes in the end. The disaster comes, and it is terrible, and it passes, and the world goes on, and the terror fades into a story, and the story fades into a legend, and the legend fades, at last, into the gentle background hum of the long human past. One more tale among the countless tales of things that happened once to people who are no longer here to remember them. If you are still awake out there, thank you for staying with me through the whole long journey, through the barn and the wind and the burning river and the long cold night in the water and the slow, stubborn rising of the city from its ashes. There is another story waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready for it, and it will be here when you wake. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like and subscribe, or to leave a thought down in the comments below, and perhaps your location and your local time, so that some other sleepless soul, somewhere far away, might know they are not the only one awake beneath the dark. But for now, there is nothing left to do, and nowhere left to be. Close your eyes and let yourself drift off to sleep. Good night and sweet dreams.